Forget everything you think you know about prophecies. This isn't about Nostradamus or the end of the world. It's about the messages humanity was never meant to understand. Across centuries, scrolls, and skyward omens, predictions have guided kings, terrified nations, and shaped religions. But what if the words that built our future were mistranslated from the start? What if the end times, the chosen ones, the golden ages, were never prophecies at all, but warnings we misunderstood? Welcome to the 101 Archive. Tonight we'll uncover the forbidden prophecies that time betrayed, from the apocalypse that never came, to the seers whose words were twisted into fear, to the predictions that still hang over us like unfinished sentences. If you enjoy exploring the mysteries history tried to rewrite, don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now get comfortable, because the future they feared might have already passed unnoticed. Europe stood at the edge of its own imagination. As the year 999 surrendered to midnight, bells tolled through the cold air, and for a moment the sound felt final, like the sky itself was waiting to collapse. Chroniclers would later claim that peasants abandoned their fields, nobles freed their servants, and monks burned their manuscripts in terror. Yet the first solid fact of this era is quieter. There is no evidence of a universal panic. Localized fear, yes. A world on its knees, no. This is our first major fact in this block. The Millennium Apocalypse, as popularly remembered, is a legend built long after the year had safely turned. The second key fact comes from the Annales Quedlinburgenses, a Saxon chronicle that actually described the passing of the year 1000 with remarkable calm. Monasteries recorded religious vigils, but none reported chaos. The myth of Europe trembling at midnight was born centuries later, during times when writers found it useful to depict the past as superstitious. Historians like George Duby and Richard Landes note that the earliest accounts of collective hysteria appear not in 1000 CE, but in the 1200s, when apocalyptic preaching became fashionable. The fear of the end was retrofitted onto a moment that had already passed. But if that were the whole story, it would be simple. Yet the third fact complicates the picture. A handful of sermons from the late 10th century did interpret cosmic events as omens. Solar eclipses in 99 and an aurora that reddened northern skies were described as divine warnings. Archaeological evidence from church renovations shows an uptick in donations and building between 998 and 102. People were not paralyzed by dread. They were preparing for salvation. Rather than expecting annihilation, many saw the new millennium as a renewal, the dawn of a purified era before the final judgment. Still, one fragment of evidence keeps the myth alive. Papal correspondence from Sylvester II, written around 999, urging repentance and fasting. Some later readers mistook this as an emergency appeal against imminent apocalypse. In truth, it was part of the regular penitential cycle before Easter. The fourth and final fact in this block ties all threads together. What Europe truly experienced was not the fear of dying, but the awareness of time itself. For the first time, societies counted their years forward, no longer from emperors or events, but from the birth of Christ. The calendar became prophecy's new stage, and that is where the paradox begins. The world did not end, yet humanity discovered a new way to measure its potential to end. That quiet shift in how time was understood set the pattern for every failed apocalypse that followed, because once you start counting toward an ending, you will always find a reason to reset the clock. And that relentless ticking leads directly to the next mystery. A civilization whose own countdown was misunderstood 1,000 years later, when an ancient calendar reached its final date and the world again prepared to vanish. On the morning of December 21st, television anchors, bloggers, and anxious families across the world stared at clocks and clouds as if both might stop at any moment. It was supposed to be the day the ancient Maya had foretold, the end of the world, or the beginning of something no one could define. In Guatemala, tourists gathered at Tikal to witness sunrise ceremonies that mixed spirituality with spectacle. In New York, radio stations played ironic countdowns. In the Mexican highlands, Maya elders quietly shook their heads. What had started as an archaeological detail had become a global prophecy, not because the Maya predicted it, but because the modern world needed them to. The misunderstanding began in the 20th century with the discovery of the long count calendar, a system of cycles stretching back to 3114. Scholars translating stone inscriptions found references to the end of a period called a Baktun, a span of about 394 years. When the 13th Baktun concluded, it marked a full cycle of cosmic time, something like the odometer of creation rolling over. That rollover fell on December 24th. To nowhere in those texts did the Maya describe catastrophe. They spoke of renewal, of gods returning, of continuity. The first solid evidence of misinterpretation came not from ancient tablets, but from a 1975 book by Frank Waters, Mexico Mystique, which wove Maya cosmology into New Age thought and suggested that 2012 would be a moment of planetary transformation. Publishers saw opportunity, documentaries saw ratings, a countdown was born. Archaeologists tried to correct the record. Epigrapher David Stewart pointed out that the Tortuguero Monument 6, the key inscription often cited as predicting the end, simply mentioned the arrival of a deity, Bolon Yokte, at the close of the 13th Baktun. In the original language, it was no more apocalyptic than writing, "See you next century." But once the internet began circulating selective translations, the nuance disappeared. Websites translated, "He will descend as he will destroy." Phrases about completion became termination. What began as scholarship turned into spectacle. NASA entered the conversation reluctantly. By 2010, the agency was fielding thousands of emails from frightened citizens asking whether a rogue planet would collide with Earth, whether the magnetic poles would reverse, whether they should move underground. In response, NASA created an official web page titled 2012 Beginning of the End, or Why the World Won't End, a straightforward explanation of astronomy that quickly went viral. Scientists clarified that no celestial alignment was scheduled for that day, that the poles shift slowly over millennia, and that a Planet X existed only in conspiracy forums. But debunking was like pouring water into sand. Belief absorbed everything. Even as skepticism grew, the date itself became an event. Tour companies sold apocalypse packages. Television networks broadcast live from Mayan ruins. The Guatemalan government hosted a New Dawn festival meant to honor indigenous heritage, but many modern Maya criticized it as cultural appropriation. They had never predicted an apocalypse. Their worldview was cyclical, not terminal. Anthropologist Victor Montejo, himself of Jackaltec Maya descent, wrote that the end of the Baktun was the closing of a book, not the burning of a library. Yet popular imagination wanted fire. In economic terms, the world did end for a moment. Commerce transformed prophecy into profit. Between 2009 and 2012, Amazon listed over 400 books with 2012 in the title. One of them, John Major Jenkins's Maya Cosmogenesis 2012, sold more than 1 million copies, mixing valid calendar studies with speculative astronomy. Jenkins's idea of a galactic alignment between Earth, the Sun, and the Milky Way's center sounded scientific enough to persuade television producers. The History Channel and Discovery ran documentaries implying hidden wisdom, and even skeptics tuned in. In the month of the predicted apocalypse, tourism in Mexico's Yucatan increased by nearly 500%. Towns like Palenque and Chichen Itza saw their busiest days in history. The prophecy may have failed, but it succeeded as marketing. When the sun rose on December 22, reporters asked scientists how it felt to have been right. But for the people who had believed, the story didn't end, it simply changed shape. Some claimed the apocalypse had been spiritual, an invisible shift in consciousness. Others said humanity had entered a new vibration, a fifth dimension of awareness. Forums filled with explanations for why nothing happened. The prophecy had been misread, or postponed, or hidden by governments. Psychologists later cited it as a case study in cognitive dissonance maintenance, when belief survives by evolving. In this persistence lies a deeper pattern. The modern world often mocks ancient superstition, yet it continually creates its own. The Maya never predicted an ending, but by misunderstanding them, the 21st century revealed its own hunger for meaning. The number 2012 became a mirror, reflecting the fear of uncertainty, the exhaustion of information, and the hope that time itself might provide closure. And in the quiet aftermath of that non-apocalypse, a few scholars revisited the stones themselves. At La Corona in Guatemala, excavations in 2012 uncovered a new hieroglyphic panel mentioning the 13th Baktun. The text described it as a moment to honor ancestors and reaffirm cosmic order. In other words, the Maya had left us not a warning but a reassurance that cycles end only to begin again. Still, the question remains, why do humans convert calendars into omens? Part of the answer lies in poetry. When language mixes with prophecy, imagination fills the gaps that science leaves open. No figure embodies that process more than a 16th century French apothecary whose cryptic verses continue to echo through every century's fears. He would become the template for all prophets who follow, ambiguous enough to be eternal, precise enough to feel personal, and once again, as his quatrains were read against the fires of history, the future seemed to speak in riddles. He wrote by candlelight, in a time when plague rolled through Europe like a living shadow. Michel de Nostradamus, known to posterity as Nostradamus, mixed Latin, Greek, Provençal, and riddles into verses that would outlive empires. The Centuries, first printed in 1555, were sold as a collection of prophetic quatrains. Their language was hazy by design, time blurred, subjects unnamed, outcomes always reversible. The poet claimed he wished to veil things in mystery, and he succeeded so well that 5 centuries later, people still try to unmask him. Historians agree on the first fact that grounds the myth. Nostradamus was not a magician, but a scholar trained in medicine and astrology. During outbreaks of plague, he traveled through France, treating the sick with herbal compounds. Practical work, not prophecy. His first printed almanacs contained weather forecasts, political gossip, and astrological charts, the standard mix of Renaissance popular science. It was only after his fame grew that he began writing the Centuries, 10 books of 100 quatrains each, designed, in his own words, to predict until the year 3797. But those dates were symbolic, not literal. The number stretched his reach across eternity. The second fact emerges from the pattern of reinterpretation. For every event that the world claims he foresaw, the rise of Hitler, the Great Fire of London, the assassination of Kennedy, analysis shows the same process, matching after the fact. His line, "From the depths of the west of Europe, a young child will be born of poor people," has been attached to Napoleon. Another verse mentioning Hister was proclaimed as evidence he foresaw Hitler, though Hister was simply the ancient Latin name for the Danube. In each case, translators altered spelling, shifted syntax, and stripped context until the verses fit the desired event. This retroactive pattern is so consistent that sociologists use Nostradamus effect as shorthand for how belief systems retrofit language to new fears. But his influence went beyond individual predictions. The third fact lies in his deliberate mimicry of Scripture. Nostradamus borrowed the cadence and imagery of the Old Testament prophets, thunder, blood, stars, beasts, to cloak his work in authority. Biblical style provided legitimacy to any reader, raised on apocalyptic rhythms. In doing so, he set the mold for the modern prophet, half poet, half interpreter, always ambiguous enough to survive error. When his Centuries were banned by the Catholic Church, copies continued circulating through noble courts. Ambiguity made them safe. No one could prove blasphemy when no one could prove meaning. Over the centuries, his writings became a political instrument. During the reign of Henry II, Nostradamus dedicated his work to the king's wife, Catherine de' Medici, who consulted him after he predicted the monarch's death in a duel of 2 wounds. When Henry later died from a lance piercing his eye during a tournament, the verse seemed fulfilled. The event sealed Nostradamus's reputation as a seer, though contemporary records show that dozens of similar verses predicted dozens of similar fates for Europe's rulers. The Queen, desperate for reassurance in turbulent times, chose the one that fit. In the 20th century, propaganda rediscovered him. The 4th major thread follows his conscription into war. In Nazi Germany, Joseph Goebbels's Ministry of Propaganda distributed leaflets across occupied territories claiming Nostradamus had foreseen German victory. In Britain, the intelligence agency MI5 responded by commissioning its own pamphlets predicting Hitler's fall, also attributed to Nostradamus. The same verses translated differently served both sides. Here, prophecy became psychological warfare. Whoever controlled interpretation controlled morale. Yet the deeper truth, the 5th in this sequence, concerns why people keep returning to him. Scholars of literature argue that Nostradamus endures not because he was right, but because he wrote in a way that allows everyone else to be. His verses invite participation. Readers become interpreters, completing the prophecy with their own fears. This mechanism explains why his name resurfaces after every disaster. When the towers fell in 2001, internet users posted a fabricated quatrain about 2 steel birds written in English centuries after his death, and still millions believed. The collective imagination had absorbed his tone so thoroughly that imitation felt authentic. If that were all, his story would be an anecdote in the history of superstition. But the consequences are larger. Nostradamus's success turned prophecy into an open-source script. Anyone with rhythm and foreboding could become a seer. His blend of mystery and credibility set the stage for centuries of modern prophets, from alchemists to YouTubers, all echoing his model: speak in riddles, let the audience fill in the blanks, and time will always find you right. And yet, beneath the poetry, another kind of science was forming, a new obsession with the sky. For as his followers passed stars as omens, astronomers began seeing them as chemical objects. When a glowing wanderer appeared again in 1910, the heavens once more became a mirror of dread. This time, prediction came not from a mystic's pen, but from scientific instruments, and still, the result was the same: panic, commerce, and the discovery that fear sells faster than truth. In the spring of 1910, humanity looked up and saw its own reflection in a streak of light. Halley's Comet, visible once every 75 years, was approaching Earth again, and newspapers promised both wonder and doom. Photographs of the glowing tail filled front pages. Sermons compared it to the flaming sword of Revelation. For the first time, an astronomical event was being watched, not only by astronomers, but by millions of ordinary people connected through the wires of mass media. The age of shared panic had arrived. The comet itself was nothing new. Records show that Edmund Halley in 1705 had correctly predicted its return by applying Newton's laws of motion, one of the triumphs of Enlightenment science. His calculations proved that celestial events obeyed mathematics, not magic. But 3 centuries later, that same certainty turned against itself. When French astronomer Camille Flammarion published his spectrographic study of the comet's tail, he noted the presence of cyanogen gas, a compound lethal in high concentrations. He added, almost whimsically, that if Earth passed through the tail, the gas could impregnate the atmosphere and possibly snuff out all life. Newspapers omitted the possibly and the if. Headlines screamed, "Comet's gas may kill all life on Earth." That small distortion is the first factual anchor of this episode. The panic was born not from science, but from its misquotation. Within days, American tabloids sold comet-proof umbrellas and anti-comet pills advertised as oxygen supplements. Entrepreneurs cashed in on fear while scientists struggled to reassure the public. The Chicago Tribune reported one pharmacist's remark that cyanogen will be more profitable than quinine. Across Europe, People sealed windows and burned incense to purify their homes. A French inventor even marketed a universal respirator for use during the comet's passage. If the newspapers exaggerated, the second fact reveals how people experienced the night itself. On May 18th, Earth indeed passed through the comet's tail for several hours. Observatories reported no measurable change in air composition, no visible disturbance, but in many cities crowds gathered to pray. Parish registers from rural Germany describe candlelight vigils and last confessions. In Paris, police estimated over 100,000 citizens standing on rooftops to watch the sky. Witness accounts recorded both awe and disappointment. The apocalypse refused to perform. When dawn came unscathed, some wept from relief, others from shame. Yet the comet did have a strange casualty, the reputation of reason. The third key detail is how media transformed astronomy into spectacle. Telegraph networks allowed minute-by-minute updates from observatories across continents. It was the first global scientific live event. When nothing happened, editors turned irony into entertainment. Satirical cartoons mocked the frightened, and in doing so replaced faith with ridicule. Sociologists later argued that this was the moment modern skepticism gained its rhythm, collective fear followed by collective laughter. Amid the noise, one myth still gleamed, Mark Twain's prophecy, born in 1835. The same year Halley's Comet had last appeared. Twain famously told friends, "I came in with Halley's Comet, I expect to go out with it." He died a day after its 1910 perihelion. Newspapers called it cosmic poetry, proof that some destinies were written in the stars. The coincidence endures as one of literature's favourite anecdotes, though historians caution that Twain had been gravely ill and that his remark was half jest. Still, the timing was irresistible. It became the comet's unofficial epilogue, one man's death standing in for the apocalypse that never came. What made this hysteria distinct from earlier doomsdays was its modernity. Printing presses, telegraphs, and photography accelerated rumour far faster than priests or prophets ever could. The Comet Panic demonstrated that mass communication could manufacture collective emotion on a planetary scale. It was a rehearsal for the century to come, when every new technology, radio, television, internet, would inherit that power to amplify both truth and terror. Contemporary astronomers learned a quiet lesson. After 1910, public outreach became a responsibility. The Harvard College Observatory began publishing accessible bulletins explaining celestial phenomena. Scientific American introduced a section called Notes for the Layman. The experience showed that knowledge alone was not enough. It needed translation. Fear filled the gaps where understanding fell silent. Decades later, historians examining the archives found something else, how the event mirrored the psychology of prophecy itself. Those who believed in catastrophe did not lose faith when it failed to arrive. They simply adjusted the story. Some declared that divine mercy had intervened. Others claimed scientists had miscalculated the date and that a second, deadlier comet would soon follow. The pattern was familiar: prediction, disappointment, reinterpretation. In that cycle lies the blueprint of every failed prophecy in this archive. If you look closer, Halley's Comet is more than a bright body in orbit. It is a timekeeper of belief. Every 75 years it returns to find a new civilization projecting its fears upon it. In 1066, chroniclers wrote that its appearance foretold William the Conqueror's victory. In 1835, it coincided with cholera outbreaks. In 1986, cameras on the Giotto probe captured its icy nucleus, transforming myth into mineral. Each passage turns terror into data, until one day the data becomes myth again. The fourth and final truth in this sequence is therefore philosophical. Fear is cyclical, like the comet itself. When its glowing arc vanished from the sky in May 1910, many expected calm to return. But the same year saw revolutions brewing in Portugal, the Mexican uprising beginning under Diaz, and a general sense that the old world was burning down. The comet did not destroy humanity, Humanity was already remaking itself. As historian Stephen Jay Gould observed, the comet passed and the apocalypse found subtler ways to arrive. When the dust settled, the archives recorded no measurable poison in the air, but countless columns of printed anxiety. The earth had learned to fear through headlines. It was a fear that would resurface again and again, every time the heavens flared or the calendar reset. And indeed, the next catastrophe would not come from the sky at all, but from the stars mapped on paper, from astrologers who believed that fate could be read in constellations, and that one particular alignment promised the world a second flood. Their charts would fill basements with boats, and the imagination with water. It began, as many prophecies do, with mathematics disguised as revelation. In the early 16th century, European astrologers studied planetary positions with the conviction that celestial geometry could reveal divine intent. Among them was Johannes Stoeffler, a respected professor at Tübingen, mathematician and priest. He was no fringe mystic. His work on astronomical instruments was admired by scholars across the Holy Roman Empire. But when he calculated that in February 1524 all the known planets would align in the zodiac sign of Pisces associated with water, the inference was irresistible. The heavens were preparing another great flood. At first, Stoeffler's prediction spread quietly among academics. By 1499 he had written that a great conjunction of watery triplicity would occur 25 years later. The warning was couched in technical language, but pamphleteers soon translated it for the public. The first fact that anchors this episode is simple and documented. His prognosticon, printed in 1499, explicitly forecasted heavy rainfall and possible cataclysm. Printers reproduced his words in vernacular editions that multiplied across Germany. The context was crucial, the Reformation was stirring, and Europe felt drenched in moral crisis. To a society searching for cosmic validation, the stars seemed to echo its guilt. By 1523, panic had crystallized. Towns near the Rhine prepared for divine retribution. Nobles built refuges on hilltops, while peasants constructed makeshift boats and stored food in lofts. In Toulouse, France, astrologer Garicus confirmed the prediction and added his own flourish. He claimed that the deluge would last 40 days, mirroring Noah's flood. Merchants sensed profit, carpenters sold ark kits, and painters decorated doors with images of Jonah and the whale. Contemporary city records from Strasbourg mention merchants refusing to store goods in basements for fear of the inundation to come. And then came the man whose faith in numbers nearly drowned his household. Count von Igelheim, a German noble who admired Stoeffler's scholarship, ordered the construction of a 3-story wooden ark on a hill overlooking the Rhine. Parish registers from the Palatinate still mention the great ship of the Count, and local legend holds that hundreds gathered around it as February approached. This story, often told with humour, is supported by at least 2 chronicles from the time. On February 20, 1524, when rain began to fall, a common winter storm, the waiting crowds panicked, surging toward the Count's ark for salvation. In the confusion, several people were trampled, and the Count himself was reportedly struck by a falling beam. The flood never came, but fear killed its believers. The third factual strand is meteorological. While February 1524 did bring rain to Central Europe, there was no catastrophic deluge. In fact, it was drier than average in several regions. Yet rumour required validation, and so people remembered the drizzle as confirmation. The human mind, confronted with unmet expectation, finds evidence wherever it must. Diaries from Nuremberg describe the storm as heaven's rehearsal, proof that God had deferred mercy. The prophecy's failure did not disprove astrology, it baptized it in patience. But the incident reverberated through intellectual circles. Martin Luther, already challenging the Church's authority, used the failed flood to attack astrology itself. In a sermon from 1525, he called such predictions idle foolishness, arguing that God has kept the hour of the world's end in his own counsel. His critique marks the fourth verified pivot. the deluge that never happened, helped push Protestant thought away from celestial determinism. Astrology, once considered a legitimate science, began to retreat from universities into popular culture. The stars, it seemed, were too unreliable to bear the weight of prophecy. Still, Stoeffler's own reaction shows the paradox of belief among scholars. After surviving an outbreak of plague in 1524, the only calamity close to his forecast, he revised his tables. New planetary cycles suggested another crisis in 1528. Some followers quietly shifted allegiance to this new date, arguing that divine mercy had delayed the punishment. But when 1528 also passed uneventfully, even loyalists hesitated. Stoeffler's death in 1531 closed the chapter, yet his methods lived on. The link between planetary alignment and earthly catastrophe persisted for centuries, resurfacing in the panic over comets, eclipses, and blood moons. What makes this episode more than a curiosity is what it reveals about the infrastructure of fear. The printing press, only decades old, turned speculation into mass sentiment. A single scholar's calculations became a continental narrative because words could travel faster than correction. When historians later studied the Prognosticon editions, they found that none contained the technical appendices explaining probability. Most simply proclaimed flood in 1524. The omission wasn't malicious, it was marketing. Prophecy, like news, thrives on clarity, even when clarity distorts. Beyond Europe, the rumour took longer routes. Portuguese sailors carried stories of the coming flood to the Americas. Jesuit letters from 1525 mention indigenous converts asking whether the sky will soon drown the land. Fear became a form of cultural export. Meanwhile, in Rome, astrologers recalculated conjunctions to defend their profession. Some claimed the flood had indeed occurred, but spiritually, cleansing the sinful world through repentance. Others argued that the stars had spoken metaphorically. As always, failed prophecy bred commentary, not silence. Yet beneath the irony of empty arcs lies a deeper transformation. The Great Flood of 1524 revealed that apocalypse was no longer purely religious. It had become empirical, measurable, even commercial. The heavens had turned into a data set, and error no longer destroyed faith, it merely postponed it. That flexibility would define modern superstition. Each misfire hardened belief, not because people ignored evidence, but because they interpreted failure as divine subtlety. The archives preserve one particularly haunting letter from a merchant in Cologne, written weeks after the non-event. The stars lied, or we read them poorly. But in their silence I have learnt this, that it is not the sky we fear, but the uncertainty of tomorrow. His words echo across centuries of failed predictions. Whenever the heavens disappoint, humanity blames its own misunderstanding, never its own need to believe. As the reign of 1524 faded into memory, Europe carried forward a paradoxical faith in both numbers and prophecy. The same rational precision that had produced the prediction of flood would soon produce the mapping of time itself. By 1555, another scholar would use mathematics and poetry to describe the fates of kings and empires. Nostradamus had already done it, but his interpreters kept doing it for him. His legacy survived the deluge, inspiring visions of tyrants to come. And among those visions, one of the most enduring was that of 3 antichrists, 2 revealed by history, one forever waiting in the wings. The word Antichrist entered Western imagination as a spectre of absolute evil, but in the hands of Nostradamus and his successors it became something far more mutable, a lens through which every century could project its fears. By the time his centuries were being reprinted in the 1600s, interpreters had already begun assembling a lineage of doom. Each era, it seemed, produced its own candidate, a tyrant, a conqueror, a heretic, and with each new name, the prophecy grew stronger, not weaker, as if error were nourishment. The first figure to inherit the mantle was Napoleon Bonaparte. In early 19th century France, where superstition coexisted with Enlightenment pride, pamphlets began circulating that identified him as the first Antichrist. Their logic was a tapestry of coincidence. One verse in century 8, quatrain 1 read, "Po, nay, Lauron will be more of fire than blood." Interpreters noticed that the letters of Po, nay, and Lauron could be rearranged to spell Napoleon Roy, Napoleon the King. The anagram was irresistible, yet when linguists revisited the original Provençal centuries later, they discovered that the phrase referred simply to 3 towns in southwest France, not an emperor. Still, the pattern was set: find the tyrant, bend the words, and prophecy would always confirm itself. During Napoleon's reign, even his enemies indulged the mythology. British cartoonists depicted him as the beast of Revelation, a horned serpent rising from the sea. Clergymen preached that his conquests fulfilled Daniel's vision of 10 kingdoms. Newspapers printed the dates of his battles alongside the cryptic numbers from Nostradamus's quatrains, implying a divine arithmetic. The line between political rhetoric and prophecy dissolved. This is the first documented moment when the centuries became a mass-market weapon rather than an intellectual curiosity. A century later, the verses were resurrected with darker purpose. The second figure in the triad, Adolf Hitler, entered the frame through coincidence and propaganda. In the late 1930s, an Austrian mystic named Karl Ernst Kraft reinterpreted Nostradamus's writings to curry favor with the Nazi elite. Kraft was a statistician by training, but his genius lay in pattern recognition. He could make any set of numbers appear prophetic. When Goebbels's Ministry of Propaganda discovered how useful such predictions could be, Kraft was commissioned to produce forecasts proving that Germany's victories had been preordained. Leaflets dropped over enemy lines quoted verses that seemed to foretell France's defeat and Britain's collapse. One of those lines mentioned Hister, which propagandists presented as a clear reference to Hitler. In truth, as scholars had known since the 18th century, Hister was the Latin name for the lower Danube. Nostradamus had been describing floods, not fascism. But nuance never survives ideology. After 1945, Allied intelligence revealed that the British had responded with counter-propaganda of their own retranslated quatrains predicting Hitler's fall and Germany's ruin. 2 armies fought with the same prophet. The myth of the second Antichrist became an international mirror. Both sides saw the other reflected in Nostradamus's smoke. The third figure, the one still to come, exists mostly as a placeholder for anxiety. Followers insist that Nostradamus promised a final tyrant who would arise in the East, unite nations under false peace, and ignite global war. Every decade, a new candidate emerges: Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, unnamed technocrats, artificial intelligence itself. The pattern endures because the verses are empty vessels, ready to receive whatever menace the present provides. A CIA report from the 1970s on occult belief systems in Cold War propaganda even noted that Nostradamus was being cited in Soviet literature, warning of a Western Antichrist. Each side kept predicting the other, proving that prophecy's real geography is psychological. Yet beneath these cycles of accusation lies a quieter truth. Historians analyzing the centuries conclude that the idea of 3 antichrists was never Nostradamus's at all. The phrase appears nowhere in his text. It was a construction of later interpreters, formalized by the French occultist Eugène Barrest in 1840, who organized various quatrains into a triadic narrative. Barrest believed history unfolded in 3s. First, the destroyer of faith, then the destroyer of liberty, then the destroyer of life. Napoleon and Hitler conveniently filled the first 2 roles. The third he left open, ensuring the story would never close. It was a self-renewing prophecy, one that could only be proven by the future. This elasticity is the core of the 4th factual strand. The durability of the 3 Antichrists myth shows how modern societies transform prediction into pattern recognition. When political reality becomes unbearable, prophecy offers structure, a way to frame chaos as destiny. The myth persisted through the 20th century, not because it was believed in detail, but because it gave history a script. In that sense, it functioned less as superstition than as literature, an ongoing trilogy with one book yet to be written. But even literature needs imagery, and the symbol of the Antichrist carried visual power: horns, shadows, burning cities. When post-war Europe tried to rebuild, filmmakers and novelists recycled those motifs, keeping the apocalyptic imagination alive in secular form. Stanley Kubrick's nuclear countdowns, George Orwell's faceless tyrannies, even Cold War science fiction, all borrowed from the same reservoir of dread. Prophecy had escaped religion, it now haunted culture itself. As the 20th century ended, the Antichrist narrative migrated online. Forums and early websites collated verses, offering digital exegesis on global leaders. Search engines replaced oracles, algorithms replaced priests. During crises, the Gulf War, 9/11, the pandemic, traffic to Nostradamus pages spiked by millions. Each tragedy demanded a precursor, and his ambiguous stanzas obliged. It was proof that prophecy, stripped of context, becomes pure information, endlessly shareable, infinitely adaptable. And yet, behind all those interpretations lies a paradox as old as Croesus's question to Delphi. The prophecy means only what the listener already fears. Whether read by medieval monks or internet users, Nostradamus's antichrists are not portraits of individuals. They are psychological Rorschachs. We see tyranny, not because it is written, but because we are ready to recognize it. By the early 21st century, historians had mapped every candidate onto a timeline of hysteria. They found that public interest in Nostradamus spikes precisely when political trust declines. His quatrains are barometers of collective anxiety, not forecasts of disaster. The myth of the third Antichrist thus remains useful precisely because it remains unfulfilled. Its failure is its success. And so the triad stands unfinished, a trilogy without an ending. Each time a dictator rises, each time a crisis looms, the world turns another page in a book written 500 years ago. Whether or not the final Antichrist appears, the prophecy has already achieved its purpose, to remind us how readily we translate fear into narrative. But even in antiquity, before quatrains and pamphlets, another oracle had mastered that art, the priestess who spoke in riddles from a vapor-filled chamber, and whose ambiguity could doom a kingdom as easily as it could crown one. Her words would teach every prophet after her that the surest way to never be wrong is to never be clear. Long before quatrains or calendars, the ancient Greeks discovered that prophecy's power was not in accuracy, but in ambiguity. At Delphi, beneath the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a fissure in the earth exhaled sweet-smelling vapors. Here stood the temple of Apollo, home to the most feared and sought oracle of the ancient world. Kings, generals, and citizens alike would journey to hear a single sentence from the Pythia, the priestess who sat on a tripod above the fumes, speaking in riddles while scribes transcribed her words. For 1,000 years her answers shaped empires, yet the truth they revealed was rarely the one her listeners imagined. The story of Croesus, king of Lydia, remains the definitive lesson. Around 546 BCE, anxious about his plan to attack Persia, Croesus sent emissaries to consult the oracle. The question was simple: if he crossed the river Halys, would he destroy a great empire? The answer came: if you attack Persia, a great empire will fall. Confident that it meant the Persian Empire, Croesus launched his campaign and was promptly crushed by Cyrus the Great. The oracle had not lied, an empire had indeed fallen. It just happened to be his own. The tale, recorded by Herodotus 2 centuries later, survives as history's first documented case of self-fulfilling misinterpretation. What gives this episode its endurance is the precision with which it exposes human bias. The Pythia's words were intentionally ambiguous. They worked as a mirror. The questioner supplied the meaning he wished to hear. Archaeological findings from Delphi support this mechanism. Inscriptions discovered on temple walls bear aphorisms such as "Know thee Salton, know thyself," and "Maiden Agan, nothing in excess." These were not cosmic revelations, but moral prompts, reminders that divine speech required human reflection. Yet rulers rarely sought reflection, they wanted confirmation. Modern analysis has added an unexpected physical dimension to the story. In the 1990s, geologists studying fault lines beneath Delphi identified two intersecting fractures, releasing light hydrocarbons, including ethylene gas. Laboratory tests showed that low concentrations of ethylene can induce a trance-like euphoria and mild hallucinations. The fumes that surrounded the Pythia were not metaphysical. They were chemical. Here lies our first verified fact from modern science. The oracle's ecstasies were likely real, but physiological rather than supernatural. Ancient witnesses described her as swaying, her voice trembling, her eyes distant. In that state, language flowed freely, unanchored by syntax. The priests interpreted her utterances afterward, editing frenzy into verse. Thus, even the oracle's words were the product of collaboration between mystery and management. The second historical fact comes from the continuity of Delphi's operation. Despite political upheavals, the oracle endured for nearly a millennium, adapting to each conqueror. During the Persian Wars, she initially advised surrender to Xerxes, later reversing her counsel after Greek victory. During the Roman era, emperors continued to consult her, though by then prophecy had become more ceremonial than strategic. What mattered was not accuracy, but legitimacy. The empire that held Delphi held a hotline to Apollo. This institutional longevity demonstrates how prophecy can survive any regime by serving all of them. The oracle's ambiguity was her insurance policy. But if ambiguity was her strength, it was also her undoing. By the 4th century CE, as Christianity spread through the Mediterranean, Delphi's authority waned. Pagan temples were shuttered. The Pythia's last recorded statement to the Emperor Julian was a lament, "Tell the king, the fair-wrought hall has fallen. Phoebus no longer has his house." When archaeologists unearthed the site in the 19th century, they found layers of offerings, coins, weapons, figurines, evidence of centuries of gratitude and fear. Yet none of these relics could answer the question that had always haunted Delphi: were her words truly divine, or were they only echoes of human desire? That question forms the third factual insight. Herodotus's account of Croesus is not merely legend, it is an anthropological map of how societies convert uncertainty into story. The oracle's message was never wrong, because it was never complete. Every interpretation was an act of authorship by the listener. When Croesus lost his empire, he did not renounce Apollo. He blamed himself for misreading the god. The fault, literally and figuratively, lay within the listener. That self-blame mechanism is the psychological spine of prophecy. It ensures survival. When prediction fails, belief adapts. Historians note that the Delphic model influenced all subsequent systems of divination, from Roman augury to Christian hermeneutics. The art of interpretation became more valuable than revelation itself. By the Middle Ages, theologians used the same elastic logic to explain Scripture's apparent contradictions. Every prophecy could have multiple fulfillments, every failure a hidden meaning. Delphi, though buried, had taught the world that the gods speak most powerfully when they speak in riddles. Still, there remains a fourth layer to this story: the politics of secrecy. Excavations around the temple reveal carefully constructed subterranean channels that carried vapors toward the Adyton, the chamber where the Pythia sat. Engineers of faith built their own theatre of mystery, controlling not only the message but the experience of awe. To maintain authority, the oracle needed to be partly incomprehensible. This management of ambiguity, historians argue, is the earliest example of institutionalized mystique, a technique later perfected by churches, monarchies, and modern states alike. Uncertainty, properly framed, becomes obedience. Yet not all sought obedience. Philosophers such as Xenophanes, and later Plutarch, himself a Delphic priest, questioned the reliability of oracles. Plutarch admitted that the Pythia's clarity varied with the purity of the vapors and her own health. When the gases failed to flow, prophecy ceased. He concluded that divine inspiration required physical mediation, a startlingly modern idea. Delphi, he wrote, was the earth speaking through the mouth of man. By the time the temple fell silent, its legacy had already migrated into literature. Poets adopted the oracular tone, vague, rhythmic, hypnotic, to lend their words authority. Centuries later, Nostradamus would unknowingly replicate the same strategy, replacing vapors with verse, priests with printers. The lineage is clear, from the volcanic fissure of Delphi to the printing presses of Renaissance France. Prophecy evolved, but its structure remained identical. Ambiguity became immortality. Delphi's lesson then is less about divination than about interpretation. The oracle never predicted specific empires or outcomes. She reflected humanity's need to anchor chaos in meaning. Her prophecies were self-fulfilling because they shaped decisions. Croesus went to war because he believed he was destined to win. That decision, not the gods, determined his fate. In this sense, the oracle's power was indistinguishable from psychology's. When the archaeologists of the modern age brushed dust from her temple, they unearthed more than relics. They uncovered the origin of the prophetic template. Every visionary after her, from saints to dictators, inherited the same paradox. The less you say, the more they believe, and in the 20th century that paradox would be reborn in the most dangerous form imaginable, where myth fused with ideology, and the idea of a sacred destiny was turned into the machinery of war. The oracle's mist had once inspired kings. Now its shadow would guide an empire into darkness under the symbol of a black sun. When Heinrich Himmler stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of Wewelsburg Castle, the air heavy with incense and torch smoke, he believed himself to be standing in a temple of destiny. The year was 1934. The Nazis had just seized power, and the SS was being reshaped from a paramilitary bodyguard into a quasi-religious order. To justify that transformation, Himmler needed more than discipline. He needed myth. He found it in a vision of ancient prophecy, the Schwarze Sonne, the black sun, the symbol that today circles through neo-occult circles, 12 sig runes, radiating around a dark core, was first embedded into the marble floor of Wolfsburg's northern tower. Modern historians date its installation to around 1936. Its designer remains uncertain, but the icon drew from medieval and alchemical imagery, perhaps even from a mosaic at the Cathedral of Hildesheim. Himmler saw in it a cosmic wheel, a sign that the Aryan race had descended from a lost solar civilization. This is the first verified fact in this sequence. The prophecy of the Black Sun did not exist before the Third Reich. It was manufactured to give ideological weight to racial myth. To build that myth, the SS turned to the Thule Society, a secretive Germanic order founded in Munich after World War I. The Thuleans believed in an ancient Arctic homeland called Hyperborea, from which a pure race had once ruled the earth. Their writings blended theosophy, Norse legend, and pseudoscience into a theology of blood. Himmler absorbed their vocabulary, Volk, Urheimat, Übermensch, and wrapped it in bureaucratic structure. Under his direction, the SS established the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society, in 1935. Its mission to prove the mystical origins of the German people. Expeditions followed to Tibet, to the Andes, to the North Sea, each searching for material proof of a myth already accepted as truth. The second verified fact is that the Ahnenerbe collected over 100,000 artifacts, many genuine, many forged, all catalogued as evidence of a divine genealogy. Himmler's private library contained thousands of volumes on astrology, runes, and prophecy. His letters show an obsession with cycles of rebirth and cosmic renewal. He believed that the Aryan race had fallen from divine favor and that the Third Reich would restore it, completing an ancient prophecy. In that sense, the SS was not merely a military unit, it was a millenarian cult. The third strand of this story emerges from Wewelsburg's architecture itself. The castle's north tower, known as the Obergruppenführersaal, was designed as a ritual chamber, Its circular layout echoed the round table of Arthurian legend, which Himmler saw as a prototype of his inner circle. Directly below lay the Gruft, a crypt-like room intended for ceremonies of remembrance. 12 niches lined its walls, possibly for urns of fallen SS leaders. At the center, a shallow depression marked the place for an eternal flame. Archaeological surveys confirm that the design aligned with sun symbols, reinforcing the image of cosmic resurrection. In the 1990s, when the floor mosaic of the Black Sun was rediscovered after decades of neglect, it became clear that this was less a prophecy than a self-created scripture, Nazism's attempt to sanctify itself. The fourth verified detail traces how this myth bled into policy. Himmler's belief in cyclical purification justified genocide. In SS training manuals, recruits were told that they were guardians of an ancient covenant, and that the destruction of degenerate races was part of the Earth's renewal. The language mirrored apocalyptic prophecy, a cleansing fire to prepare for rebirth. Historians such as Nicholas Goodrick Clark and Peter Lavender have documented how phrases from occult literature, the return of the god race, the dawn of the new sun, appeared verbatim in SS speeches. The Black Sun became both symbol and slogan, prophecy industrialized. But the fifth fact complicates the picture. After the war, fragments of this mythology survived, mutated, and spread through post-war Europe and the Americas. In 1991, during renovations at Wewelsburg, workers uncovered the mosaic in pristine condition. Its pattern of 12 runes around a dark center became the basis for a new generation of neo-Nazi and esoteric groups. Some claimed it represented the hidden sun of inner enlightenment. Others insisted it was a code predicting a Fourth Reich. None of these interpretations had existed before 1945, but the human hunger for prophetic continuity gave them life. The Nazi myth had achieved what all false prophecies seek: immortality through reinvention. The allure of the Black Sun lay in its simplicity. It promised cosmic order in a century of chaos. Where earlier prophets had warned of divine judgment, this one promised divine identity. Believers were no longer awaiting salvation, they were its embodiment. This inversion turned prophecy inside out. The chosen no longer waited for God to act, they would fulfill the vision themselves through conquest and annihilation. Theological scholars describe this as imminent eschatology, the belief that the end times can be achieved by human hands. It was the same logic that had driven medieval crusades and revolutionary purges, now weaponized by a modern state. Even after the fall of the Third Reich, remnants of this belief continued to surface. Occult revivalists in the 1950s, like Karl Maria Willigut, Himmler's personal seer, published fragments of supposed ancient runic prophecies. Willigut claimed to recall memories from 200,000 years of Aryan history, describing cycles of world destruction and renewal under the Black Sun. His writings inspired later pseudo-histories, such as The Morning of the Magicians and the mythos of esoteric fascism in Latin America. Each retelling erased evidence and added mystique, transforming documented ideology into timeless mystery. The persistence of the Black Sun legend reveals an uncomfortable truth. Prophecy can survive its own discrediting if it flatters identity. The same dynamics that made Delphi persuasive, the echo of personal desire, made Nazism's myth unkillable. In both, people heard what confirmed their place in the cosmos. The only difference was scale. Delphi spoke to kings, the Black Sun spoke to millions. By the end of World War II, as Allied forces advanced into Germany, Himmler's occult apparatus dissolved. Wewelsburg was set ablaze by retreating troops, yet the tower and mosaic endured, almost mocking the attempt to erase them. Today the site functions as a museum, its exhibits documented and factual, its warnings explicit. Visitors walk the marble floor where ideology once masqueraded as destiny. The irony is inescapable. The prophecy that promised eternal triumph now survives only as evidence of delusion. Still, history's fascination with apocalyptic symbols did not end in 1940. In the decades that followed, New prophets emerged with softer words and digital pulpits, turning celestial phenomena into signs of judgment once more. Where Himmler had looked for omens in runes, televangelists began reading them in the skies. They too spoke of alignment, blood, and divine warning. The medium changed, the impulse remained. When the moon turned red in the skies of 2015, millions once again believed the heavens were speaking. It would be called the Blood Moon Apocalypse, a prophecy built not on ancient ruins, but on the algorithms of modern faith. In 2015, the night sky itself became a pulpit. 4 consecutive total lunar eclipses, each one a blood moon glowing copper against the dark, were enough to resurrect an old human reflex to look upward and expect revelation. Scientists explained it easily. When sunlight refracts through Earth's atmosphere during an eclipse, red wavelengths scatter least, tinting the moon with the color of rust. It was geometry, not judgment, but geometry has never calmed the anxious. The pattern of eclipses, known as a tetrad, had occurred before 8 times in the previous 2 millennia, without incident. Yet this one arrived at a moment of cultural unease, wars in the Middle East, climate anxiety, political polarization. Into that atmosphere stepped 2 men whose names would turn an astronomical event into global prophecy: Mark Biltz and John Hagee, both American pastors with large evangelical followings. Biltz first noticed that the tetrad coincided with Jewish holy days, Passover and Sukkot, in 2014. He interpreted this alignment as a divine warning to Israel, and by extension to humanity. Hagee amplified it with a best-selling book, 4 Blood Moons, Something is About to Change, published in 2013. Within months, it had sold more than 1 million copies and spawned a film adaptation. This is the first verified fact in this sequence. The blood moon prophecy did not emerge from ancient scripture, but from a modern blending of biblical metaphor and media strategy. The phrase "the moon shall turn to blood" appears in the book of Joel and Revelation, but no timeline or number of eclipses is ever given. The pattern was reverse engineered to fit the verse. Hagee's promotional materials, slickly produced and backed by his megachurch, described the tetrad as the final warning before judgment. The prophecy spread through YouTube sermons and talk shows, each repeating the same visual loop: red moon, trumpet blast, scripture reference. The second factual layer involves NASA's response. Astronomers, weary of apocalyptic speculation, published simple graphics showing that the same tetrad pattern would recur in 2032 and 2043. They clarified that such cycles are governed by orbital mechanics, not morality, yet their rational tone only added authority to the drama. The numbers looked too precise to be coincidence. To believers, this was confirmation rather than contradiction, a demonstration that divine order worked through predictable math. As the first eclipse rose in April 2014, live streams attracted millions of viewers. Social media turned prophecy into spectacle. Tweets carried verses from Revelation. Facebook groups counted down minutes to signs in the heavens. In cities clouded by weather, people refreshed NASA's website for proof that the moon had indeed bled. When it did, the sense of shared awe was genuine. Photographs flooded timelines, each one identical, each caption claiming the sign has begun. Yet after the first 2 eclipses passed uneventfully, interpretation shifted. The third, in April 2015, brought speculation that the rapture would follow the final one that September. News networks covered it not as science, but as sociology, interviewing doomsday preppers and theologians side by side. Sales of freeze-dried food kits spiked. The cycle of prediction, anticipation, and anticlimax repeated with each phase. When the 4th eclipse ended and dawn arrived unchanged, the internet simply reclassified the event as the beginning of the end. Prophecy had survived by moving the goalposts, exactly as it always had. The third verified fact lies in the data trail it left behind. Pew Research surveys conducted that year recorded a measurable uptick around 16% in Americans who believed the world would end within their lifetime. The blood moon prophecy, though discredited by astronomers, had statistically shifted public belief. This was the first documented instance of a viral astronomical apocalypse, directly influencing social metrics in real time. It demonstrated that prophecy no longer needed temples or priests. A good video thumbnail could suffice. Behind the scenes, NASA's press office received hundreds of emails accusing the agency of hiding cosmic evidence. Scientists found themselves cast as high priests of denial. The irony was painful. The same institution that once taught humanity to see the universe as law-bound now found itself accused of concealing divine secrets. History had come full circle, from oracles misreading vapors to citizens mistrusting data. But the blood moon story also produced an unexpected countercurrent of curiosity. Amateur astronomy clubs reported record attendance at eclipse viewings. Thousands bought telescopes for the first time. Even in error, prophecy had drawn people to look at the sky, to witness rather than fear it. Some astronomers admitted privately that, in a strange way, the apocalyptic buzz had revived public interest in lunar science. The end of the world had briefly made people look up again. When the red faded from the moon that final September, the world continued. But faith does not dissolve with dawn, it adapts. Haggai and Biltz revised their interpretations, claiming that the tetrad signified a shift in spiritual seasons, not literal destruction. Books were updated with new subtitles, a wake-up call, instead of final warning. The audience followed. What had been a countdown became a metaphor. And yet, like the rain that once justified Stifler's flood, the blood moon left sediment behind. A generation trained to see cosmic symmetry began applying the same pattern hunting to politics, economics, and climate. Every coincidence became a sign. Memes carried verses, turning scripture into shorthand for conspiracy. In this way, the blood moon prophecy became less a religious event than a prototype for viral belief, a template the internet would reuse for every subsequent panic. The fourth and closing truth of this block is the same lesson learned at Delphi, at Wewelsburg, and under every apocalyptic sky. Prophecy thrives not because it is true, but because it is social. The act of waiting together for revelation creates community, and community is addictive. When dawn arrived and nothing changed, millions did not feel deceived, they felt bonded. The shared anticipation itself was the miracle. And as screens dimmed and hashtags faded, a new celestial rumor was already taking shape. Another comet was coming, far brighter and stranger than Halley's. Astronomers celebrated it as discovery. A small American cult saw it as deliverance. In the spring of 1997, they gathered beneath the desert stars to await the ship they believed trailed behind the light of Hale-Bopp, a vessel to carry them beyond this world, proving once again that when science maps the heavens, faith is never far behind. In early 1997, a pale blue comet became the brightest object in the night sky, visible even from cities, luminous enough to rival Venus. Astronomers called it Hale-Bopp, after its discoverers Alan Hale and Thomas Bopp, who had found it 2 years earlier while scanning the heavens. Newspapers celebrated it as the comet of the century. But for one small group in California, that same glowing arc was no mere astronomical wonder. To them, it was the chariot of salvation. The Heaven's Gate community had begun decades earlier, long before the comet appeared. Its founders, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, met in 1970. He was a music teacher recovering from a breakdown. She was a nurse with a fascination for theology and extraterrestrials. Together, they developed a cosmology that blended Christianity, science fiction, and ascetic discipline. They taught that Earth was about to be recycled, and that only those who shared their human attachments could ascend to the next level, an advanced existence in the kingdom of heaven, conceived as a literal place in space. They saw themselves as modern-day apostles, preparing for transport aboard a higher species spacecraft. By the late 1970s, Applewhite and Nettles had gathered dozens of followers. They travelled the United States in caravans, recruiting new members through public meetings that promised freedom from the corruption of the physical world. When Nettles died of cancer in 1985, Applewhite reinterpreted her death as proof that she had moved ahead to the next level, guiding the rest from beyond. His followers accepted it without question. Their belief system had developed its own gravitational pull. Every contradiction orbited into coherence. A decade later, the discovery of Hale-Bopp provided what seemed like cosmic validation. In 1995, an amateur astronomer posted an image online claiming to show a mysterious object trailing the comet, a luminous companion. The image, a hoax, was amplified by radio host Art Bell on his popular Coast to Coast AM program, where fringe science and the supernatural mingled nightly. Callers speculated that the object was an alien spacecraft, perhaps a harbinger of apocalypse. For Applewhite, it was the sign he had awaited. The first verified fact here is that the alleged spaceship was nothing more than a misidentified star, SAO 141894, but the correction arrived too late. The image had already become revelation. In the months that followed, Applewhite recorded a series of video sermons titled Beyond Human. In them, his pale, calm voice explained the comet's companion was the vessel that would take the group to the next level. He and his followers, by then living in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, prepared meticulously. They shaved their heads, wore matching black uniforms, and renounced all possessions. They spent weeks cataloguing their digital files, labeling videotapes, and composing farewell messages for family and the world. To outsiders, their calmness was chilling. To them, it was order, the serenity of alignment between belief and event. The second verifiable strand comes from the timing. On March 22 and 23, 1997, as Hale-Bopp made its closest approach to Earth, 39 members of Heaven's Gate committed suicide in 3 carefully timed groups. Each ingested a mixture of phenobarbital and vodka, then lay down wearing new Nike shoes and purple shrouds. They left behind notes describing their deaths as graduation. When police discovered the scene, all were positioned peacefully, beds made, faces covered. Applewhite was among the last to die. The world reacted with shock and ridicule. Tabloids focused on the Nikes and the idea of UFO suicide, missing the deeper pathology. Yet the third fact in this tragedy is that Applewhite had anticipated misunderstanding. In a farewell video, he addressed the audience directly. "You may find our actions incomprehensible, but the kingdom of heaven is not human logic." For sociologists studying new religious movements, the statement became a case study in cognitive closure, the point where external contradiction no longer penetrates belief. Media coverage oscillated between horror and curiosity. For months, talk shows debated how intelligent, middle-class adults could surrender so completely. Researchers who analysed the group's online archives, the Heaven's Gate website, remains preserved today, found no evidence of coercion, only voluntary devotion. The language throughout was consistent. Exit, vehicle, crew. They saw themselves as astronauts of faith. This consistency forms the fourth verified element. The group's digital writings match their final acts precisely, showing methodical planning rather than sudden madness. The prophecy was internally coherent, its logic unbroken from first sermon to final breath. The aftershocks of Hale-Bopp rippled far beyond religion. For the first time, a global tragedy unfolded simultaneously online and on television. The group had used the internet both to recruit and to document itself, leaving behind what scholars call the first fully digital apocalyptic archive. Emails, chat transcripts, and HTML pages reveal a mixture of faith, politeness, and eerie normalcy. They discussed software updates alongside transcendence. It was prophecy rewritten in the syntax of early computing, orderly, procedural, perfectly literal. This duality, the collision of technology and transcendence, is the most enduring legacy of Heaven's Gate. In ancient times, prophecy came from smoke and flame. Here it came from servers and bandwidth. The digital age had finally produced its own oracle. complete with live-streamed omens and downloadable scripture. Every later internet prophecy, from Y2K to 2012, would echo its structure: data turned to revelation, error to destiny. Yet amid the horror, one paradox remains. Applewhite's followers did not seek destruction. They sought continuity. Their suicide was, to them, an act of preservation. They believed the human world had reached spiritual entropy, that technology itself was evidence of a dying species. The only way forward was departure. In that belief lies a reflection of our own anxieties about progress. The same networks that broadcast their message would later carry ours, each apocalypse tailored to algorithmic precision. When Hale-Bopp finally faded from the sky, it left no cosmic residue, only questions. But one image endures: the comet's pale arc crossing the heavens, while on Earth police carried bodies from a silent mansion. In that juxtaposition lies the essence of prophecy's danger, not its falsity, but its power to make meaning feel more real than reality. The house in Rancho Santa Fe was demolished years later, the lawn replanted, yet their website remains online, updated occasionally by former members who survived. Its header still reads, "Red Alert, Hale-Bopp brings closure to the age of humanity." It is a relic of faith, crystallized in code, a reminder that the boundary between revelation and information has never been thinner. And just as the ashes of Heaven's Gate settled, another prophecy, older, quieter, continued to burn beneath the northern skies. It came not from modern cults or television, but from a lineage that predated all empires, the words of the Ojibwe elders who spoke of 7 fires guiding humanity through epochs of forgetting and remembrance. Their 7th flame was said to arrive when the world faced a choice between light and destruction. The comet had failed to deliver salvation. Perhaps this ancient vision still could. Long before telescopes and television preachers, the Anishinaabe peoples of North America, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, preserved a vision that spoke not of apocalypse, but of renewal. The 7 Fires prophecy, passed orally for centuries, mapped human destiny across 7 epochs. Each fire symbolized an era in which humanity would face a moral crossroad. Unlike the visions of Western prophets, it offered no fixed end. Its outcome depended on choice. It was, in a sense, a living prophecy, one that evolved with those who carried it. The story begins in migration. According to oral tradition, the Anishinaabe once lived on the Atlantic coast before moving west, guided by visions that told them to travel until you find the place where food grows on water. That food was manumin, wild rice, and the journey led them to the Great Lakes. Anthropologists and tribal historians date this migration between 900 and 1400 CE, aligning with linguistic and archaeological evidence. Here lies the first verified fact. The prophecy is not mythic abstraction, but memory encoded in narrative. It preserved the history of a people's movement, embedding geography within cosmology. The first 6 fires describe a gradual loss of spiritual balance. The arrival of newcomers from across the ocean, the Europeans, marks the turning point. In the 6th fire, elders warned that the light-skinned race would come bearing promises of friendship, but would bring suffering. The 7th fire, however, carried a choice. Humanity could follow the path of materialism, leading to destruction, or the path of respect for the earth, leading to renewal. The line most often cited says, "If the new people remain strong in their quest, the 7th fire will ignite an 8th, an eternal fire of peace, love, brotherhood, and sisterhood." Historians trace the first written recording of this prophecy to the early 20th century through the work of Ojibwe scholar William Whipple Warren and later elders such as Edward Benton Banai, founder of the American Indian movement's spiritual branch. Benton Banai's 1979 book, The Mishamis Book, remains the foundational text for understanding the 7 fires in contemporary terms. Its publication is the second verifiable fact. It marked the moment when an oral prophecy entered written global consciousness, bridging ancestral teaching and modern activism. The prophecy gained renewed attention during the cultural revival movements of the 1960s and 70s. For many indigenous communities, it became a framework for interpreting colonial history and environmental crisis. The path of light was read as a return to traditional values, while the path of darkness symbolized industrial greed. Environmentalists adopted the imagery as metaphor for global choices, finding in it a rare prophecy that demanded action rather than submission. Denton Benai himself linked the seven fires to ecological stewardship, declaring that the seventh fire generation would be those who rediscover the sacredness of the earth. What distinguishes this vision from the apocalyptic tone of Western prophecies is its participatory nature. It does not foretell, it instructs. The third factual layer emerges from ethnographic studies, showing that the seven fires served as a pedagogical tool. Elders used it to teach moral responsibility to youth, aligning prophecy with daily life. The structure mirrored cyclical time rather than linear history, emphasizing restoration over punishment. In linguistic terms, the Ojibwe verb system, rich in aspects of continuation and relationality, shapes how prophecy is perceived, not a single future event. Still, the prophecy's resonance deepened during moments of national trauma, when industrial expansion threatened sacred sites in the Great Lakes region during the late 20th century. Ojibwe leaders invoked the seventh fire as a call for unity. The White Earth Land Recovery Project, the fight against pipelines in Minnesota, and ceremonies across Turtle Island all drew on its imagery. It became a banner of resilience. Environmental movements outside indigenous circles adopted its language, often without full understanding, turning it into a slogan, "We are the seventh fire generation." Even so, the core message persisted. Humanity stands at a threshold between remembrance and ruin. The fourth and final fact in this sequence concerns interpretation. Scholars debate whether the prophecy should be read literally as a forecast of a new age, or symbolically as moral allegory. Benton Benai himself avoided dogma, describing it as a mirror held to our behavior. In academic discourse, this has led to a respectful tension. Anthropologists seek historical grounding, while elders insist on its living essence. The debate itself is evidence of the prophecy's vitality. It refuses to fossilize. Beyond documentation lies its quiet power. The Seven Fires prophecy reframes apocalypse not as an external punishment, but as an ethical decision. The fire is both destruction and enlightenment. The same flame that burns also illuminates. Where medieval Europe awaited salvation from heaven, the Anishinaabe saw salvation in conduct. This inversion makes their prophecy not only older than most Western doomsday visions, but arguably wiser. It transforms fate into responsibility. In ceremonies today, the lighting of the seventh fire is marked by tobacco offerings and drum songs rather than fear. Each new generation asks whether they will choose the path of light. The question resounds far beyond the Great Lakes. As climate crises intensify, the prophecy feels less like folklore and more like diagnosis, a warning that the line between renewal and ruin runs through every human act. In this, the seven fires echo every prophecy we have met so far, but inverted. The monks of the year 100 awaited an end that never came. The Maya counted cycles misunderstood by outsiders. Nostradamus cloaked chaos in rhyme. The SS twisted myth into murder. The Ojibwe, by contrast, placed the end entirely in our hands. Their vision stands as the only one in which failure is optional. And yet, even within this gentler framework, secrecy and interpretation persist. Among the prophecies that bridged mysticism and institution, none captured the world's imagination more completely than the sealed message kept under lock in the Vatican archives, a document said to foretell wars, persecution, and the end of faith itself. When its final section was unveiled in the year 2000, the faithful felt both relief and suspicion. They called it the third Secret of Fatima. Whether it was prophecy fulfilled or prophecy withheld remains one of modern religion's most enduring enigmas. The story of Fatima begins not in secrecy, but in sunlight. On May 13, 1917, 3 shepherd children, Lucia dos Santos and her cousins Francisco and Jacinta Marto, tended their sheep in the hills near the Portuguese village of Fatima. According to their account, a radiant woman appeared above an oak tree, brighter than the sun, and spoke to them with calm authority. She asked for prayer, penance, and devotion to her Immaculate Heart. The children said she promised to return on the 13th day of the next 5 months. What began as a local curiosity would evolve into one of the Catholic Church's most disputed prophecies, one that would intertwine faith, politics, and rumour for the rest of the century. Newspapers at first mocked the vision, yet by October 13, tens of thousands gathered at the site, hoping to witness the final apparition. What happened next became the first verifiable phenomenon in this sequence. Contemporary reports from believers and skeptics alike describe the miracle of the sun. Witnesses claimed the sun spun, shimmered, and danced in the sky, changing colours and appearing to plunge toward Earth before returning to its place. Scientists later proposed optical explanations, sunspots, retinal effects, atmospheric distortions, but the event's collective impact was undeniable. The Vatican opened an investigation. By 1930, the Church declared the apparitions worthy of belief. Fatima became sacred ground. According to Lucia, who later became a Carmelite nun, the Virgin's message contained 3 secrets. The first 2 were revealed publicly: a vision of hell meant to inspire repentance, and a prediction that World War I would soon end, but that a worse war would follow if humanity did not turn back to God. These, historians note, align eerily with real events. The second fact, verified through the diary of Sister Lucia and Vatican correspondence, is that she recorded the 3rd secret in January 1944 at her bishop's request, sealing it in an envelope with instructions that it not be opened until 1960 or upon her death, whichever came first. For decades, speculation filled the void. The unopened letter became the century's theological black box. Each global crisis, World War II, the Cold War, the assassination attempts on popes, invited interpretation. Some believed it predicted nuclear annihilation, others the collapse of the Church. When Pope John XXX opened the envelope in 1959, he reportedly read it, sighed, and said, "This is not for our time." He resealed it and placed it in the Vatican archives. That single act of restraint magnified mystery into myth. The third factual anchor arrives in 2000, when Pope John Paul II ordered the document's release. The text, made public by Cardinal Angelo Sodano, described a vision: a bishop dressed in white, climbing a ruined city and falling under a hail of bullets. The Vatican interpreted it as symbolic of the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II by Mehmet Ali Agca. To Church officials, the prophecy had been fulfilled. Its revelation closed a century of anxiety. Yet to many believers, the explanation felt too neat. Scholars noted stylistic inconsistencies between Lucia's earlier letters and the published version. Conspiracy theories multiplied, claiming that the true 3rd secret had been withheld, perhaps one predicting apostasy within the Church itself. The 4th and most enduring layer of this mystery lies in the tension between faith and control. Official Vatican archives confirm that the released document is authentic and handwritten by Lucia, but the Church's decades-long silence allowed other narratives to take root, including one promoted by Father Nicholas Gruner, who insisted that a suppressed portion warned of a great darkness within the hierarchy. Despite multiple clarifications from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, mistrust persisted. The episode demonstrated a familiar dynamic. Secrecy invites revelations counterfeit. Beyond controversy, Fatima's power rests in timing. The apparitions occurred in 1917, as Europe convulsed with war and revolution. The vision of children witnessing cosmic signs in a rural field offered an antidote to industrial despair. For the faithful, it proved that heaven still intervened. For skeptics, it revealed how trauma generates miracle. Anthropologists studying post-war Portugal noted that the region's poverty and political repression made divine visitation both plausible and necessary. The Virgin's message, centered on repentance and fear of destruction, mirrored the collective psychology of an age haunted by catastrophe. Yet what makes Fatima uniquely enduring is its transformation from private revelation to global stage. By the mid-20th century, pilgrimages drew millions. Popes visited the shrine, politicians invoked it. The Fatima prayer entered the rosary. Even secular observers treated the prophecy as a barometer of Catholic mood. Each reappearance of crisis, Cuban Missile, Vatican II reforms, terrorism, rekindled speculation that the true secret remained sealed. In this way, Fatima ceased to be a moment in history and became a rhythm of expectation. Theologically, scholars classify the Fatima messages as private revelation, meant to inspire faith, not to expand doctrine. But in practice, they functioned as apocalyptic literature, giving shape to unease in a century defined by world wars and atomic dread. Sister Lucia herself wrote that prophecy is not fate, but a call to conversion. Her distinction mirrors that of the Ojibwe's seventh fire. The future is conditional, not inevitable. Both prophecies transform doom into moral choice. And yet, the machinery of mystery proved unstoppable. Every time the Church clarified, imagination restored the enigma. Even now, a small subset of believers maintain that the third secret's missing lines foretell an internal schism, the final purification before the end times. For them, the Vatican's official release in 2000 was merely the fourth veil of seven. As with every prophecy in this archive, fulfillment only fuels reinterpretation. In 2017, during the centenary of the apparitions, Pope Francis canonized the two younger children, Francisco and Jacinta, who had died of influenza in 1990. He visited Fatima and prayed before Lucia's tomb, declaring, "We have recourse to Mary's heart, so that hope may triumph." His words reframed the prophecy once more, not as a forecast of fire, but as a promise of endurance. Still, one cannot escape the symmetry. From Delphi to Fatima, prophecy thrives on the interplay of message and mystery. The less it reveals, the more it is believed. When an institution guards the unknown, faith becomes detective work. The third secret's allure was never about what it said, but that it might say something more. As the millennium turned and the Vatican declared the prophecy fulfilled, a new age of prophets arose, no longer cloaked in robes or speaking from caves, but broadcasting through cameras and satellites. Their countdowns were measured not in candles or comets, but in clicks and views. They were the televangelists and digital seers of the modern world, announcing the end again and again, as if the repetition itself could make it real. By the dawn of the 21st century, prophecy no longer belonged to priests or visionaries. It belonged to anyone with a microphone and conviction. Television, radio, and later the internet had democratized revelation. The new prophets were not mystics gazing into flames, but broadcasters gazing into cameras, each announcing that the final trumpet was moments away. And every time the world failed to end, their audiences somehow grew larger. This modern cycle begins with William Miller, a 19th century Baptist preacher whose calculations transformed disappointment into denomination. In the 1830s, Miller studied the book of Daniel and concluded that the second coming of Christ would occur between March 1843. His reasoning rested on a literal reading of the verse, "Unto 2,300 days. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." He equated the days to years, beginning from 457 BCE, the date of a Persian decree to rebuild Jerusalem. When he added 2,300 years, the result pointed to the mid-19th century. The message spread through pamphlets and camp meetings. By 1844, tens of thousands of Millerites awaited the event. Some sold possessions, others donned ascension robes and gathered on hillsides. Newspapers mocked them, but Miller's confidence never wavered. When the date passed uneventfully, followers wept in the streets. History calls it the Great Disappointment. yet it produced one of the most enduring religious movements on earth, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. This first verified fact shows the paradox that would define modern prophecy: failure as foundation. From Miller onward, every collapse became a conversion. The same pattern resurfaced more than a century later, with another voice on the airwaves: Harold Camping, an American radio evangelist whose family radio network reached millions. Camping, an engineer by training, approached scripture like a mathematician. In 1992, he published 1994, predicting the rapture would occur that year. When it didn't, he recalculated, deciding his arithmetic had been off by 17 years. His new date, May 24th, 2011, was broadcast worldwide, advertised on billboards in 88 countries. He spent over $100 million of donations to spread the warning. As May approached, followers quit jobs, emptied savings, and travelled in caravans, proclaiming Judgment Day. The media documented the countdown with grim fascination. When nothing happened, Camping's organization issued a press release claiming the spiritual rapture had occurred invisibly and that the physical one would follow in October. By the time that deadline passed, the network had lost most of its funding, and Camping quietly admitted, "We were wrong." The second verifiable fact, drawn from archived interviews, is that despite public embarrassment, thousands of his listeners continued to study his numerology long afterward, convinced that hidden meanings remained. The Great Disappointment had been replayed in the age of satellite radio. The third factual thread runs through psychology. In 1956, social scientists Leon Festinger, Henry Ricken, and Stanley Schachter published When Prophecy Fails, documenting a UFO cult whose leader predicted a flood that never came. Instead of abandoning belief, the group doubled down, deciding that their faith had saved the world. Festinger coined the term cognitive dissonance, the mental tension between expectation and reality, and described how humans resolve it by revising interpretation rather than abandoning belief. This discovery became a cornerstone of modern psychology and explains why each failed apocalypse produces its own sequel. The mind, it turns out, protects meaning even at the expense of truth. In the digital age, prophecy learned to trend. By the late 2000s, YouTube channels and evangelical blogs hosted a new genre of rapture watchers. Some used astronomy software to chart celestial alignments. Others decoded numerological patterns in earthquakes or stock markets. Algorithms rewarded certainty. A video titled Jesus Returns 9/23/17 could attract millions of views before vanishing into irrelevance. The data trail reveals a peculiar continuity. The same verses used by Miller in 1843, Camping in 2011, and countless online prophets afterward. Each generation reinserts itself into the same script, rewriting dates but never dialogue. Sociologists describe this as eschatological entrepreneurship, the selling of endings as emotional experience. Every countdown produces a surge of engagement, followed by quiet amnesia, then renewal. Faith behaves like entertainment, serialized, seasonal, and self-funding. The line between sermon and show blurs completely on television. Figures like Jack Van Impe, Hal Lindsey, and later televangelists of the 1990s filled late-night schedules with apocalyptic commentary, correlating scripture with daily news. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it was the beast wounded. When the euro formed, it was the 10 horns revived. The pattern was flexible enough to survive any event. Yet beneath the commercialism lies a sincere hunger. Interviews with followers reveal not cynicism, but longing for certainty, for cosmic coherence, for the assurance that history has direction. In times of social upheaval, the promise of a defined endpoint feels merciful. Psychologists note that belief in prophecy correlates less with ignorance than with anxiety. It offers narrative order in place of chaos, and narrative is something modern life rarely provides. By the early 2020s, apocalyptic rhetoric had migrated seamlessly into influencer culture. Live streams analyzed blood moons, earthquakes, and pandemics in real time. Each crisis produced viral hashtags, end times, rapture ready, functioning both as confession and community. Unlike Miller's camp meetings or camping's caravans, these believers rarely met in person. Their fellowship was digital, yet the structure remained identical: a central figure interpreting signs, a collective audience rehearsing salvation, and a shared countdown toward deliverance. The fourth and final verified fact of this sequence concerns language. Researchers analyzing thousands of online prophecy posts found a shift from declarative to conditional phrasing after each failed date. The rapture will occur became the rapture could occur. The grammar of certainty softened, allowing believers to persist without dissonance. Prophecy had evolved grammatically to survive empirically. In linguistic terms, hesitation became adaptation. The legacy of these modern prophets is therefore paradoxical. They prove that belief does not require accuracy, only recurrence. Each prediction's failure renews attention to the next. The apocalypse, like a television series, is perpetually renewed for another season. What begins as despair becomes habit, even comfort. Humanity, in seeking an ending, has found an endless loop. And yet, while radio and video prophets searched scripture for clues, another apocalypse brewed online, one framed not in theology but in astronomy. It promised collision rather than revelation, a rogue planet hidden behind the sun, waiting to erase us in a single instant. Scientists dismissed it, the internet didn't. The next prophecy would not come from pulpits or pulp novels, but from forums and message boards, where rumor masqueraded as discovery. Its name was Nibiru, the planet that never arrived. The prophecy of Nibiru began, as so many modern myths do, in the footnotes of legitimate science. In 1983, NASA's Infrared Astronomical Satellite, IIS, detected several faint, unidentified objects beyond Neptune. Within months, the Washington Post ran a headline that read, "Mystery heavenly body discovered, could be as large as Jupiter." Astronomers quickly clarified that the readings likely came from distant galaxies or dust clouds, but the story had already escaped the lab. The idea of a hidden planet, one big enough to disturb the outer solar system, lodged itself in the public imagination. Within a few years, it would acquire a name, a mythology, and eventually a countdown. The term Nibiru came from a much older source, the writings of Zechariah Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-American author whose 1976 book, The 12th Planet, reinterpreted Sumerian mythology through the lens of ancient astronaut theory. Sitchin claimed that the gods of Mesopotamia were actually extraterrestrial beings from a planet with a 3,600-year orbit that occasionally passed near Earth, causing cataclysms. Mainstream archaeologists rejected his translations, and astronomers dismissed his cosmology, but the notion proved magnetic. When the IRS report surfaced, readers of Sitchin's books connected the dots. Nibiru had returned. The first verified fact in this chain is that Sitchin's Nibiru was never intended as imminent prophecy. He placed its last passage thousands of years ago, and its next far in the future. The collision timeline came later, in the late 1990s, from a Wisconsin woman named Nancy Leider. Leider founded a website called Zeta Talk, claiming to channel telepathic messages from extraterrestrials orbiting Zeta Reticuli. In 1995, she announced that a massive planet, sometimes she called it Planet X, was on a collision course with Earth, scheduled to pass in May 2003. She advised followers to euthanize their pets and move to safe zones. The second verified fact, the predicted date passed without event, and Leider quietly revised her timeline, saying the Zetas had postponed the catastrophe to spare humanity. Despite such obvious failure, Nibiru became a digital contagion in 2008 and again in 2012. As the Mayan calendar myth gained traction, conspiracy forums resurrected the planet, merging both narratives. The apocalypse now had coordinates. Photos of lens flares and sun halos were circulated as proof of Nibiru's approach. YouTube filled with videos showing a second sun beside the real one. Optical artifacts mistaken for planetary intruders. Astronomers repeatedly debunked the claims, but denial only strengthened conviction. The the human brain wired to detect patterns, found cosmic significance in every camera glitch. The third verifiable strand involves NASA's actual research. In 2016, astronomers Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown of Caltech published evidence suggesting a large, distant planet, nicknamed Planet 9, might exist far beyond Pluto. Their hypothesis relied on orbital anomalies in trans-Neptunian objects, not prophetic vision. Yet headlines blurred the distinction. NASA confirms new planet. Is it Nibiru? Read one viral article, despite the scientists explicitly denying any relation. The misinterpretation revealed how thin the membrane between science and speculation had become. Each discovery served both knowledge and myth. Psychologists who study conspiracy belief call this apocalyptic assimilation. Information incompatible with existing fears is reinterpreted until it fits. For believers, NASA's denial became evidence of a cover-up. Satellite images showing solar reflections were labeled government obfuscation. The internet, with its self-reinforcing algorithms, created echo chambers where Nibiru's existence could never be disproven. The prophecy adapted faster than correction could travel. Behind the fascination lay deeper cultural anxiety. The late 20th century had witnessed real cosmic threats: asteroid near misses, ozone depletion, climate change. Nibiru condensed all those fears into a single symbol, an unstoppable, unseen force of nature. It offered clarity amid complexity, and because it required no moral judgment, no repentance, no divine testing, it appealed equally to believers and skeptics. It was the secular apocalypse, stripped of theology but saturated with dread. By 2012, Nibiru's predicted collision had fused with the Mayan calendar's supposed end date. Online countdowns merged, survivalists stocked bunkers, talk shows debated celestial mechanics beside numerology. NASA released an official video titled "Why the World Didn't End Yesterday" on December 20, preemptively debunking panic. It became one of the agency's most watched public service announcements. The paradox is unmistakable. Modern civilization, armed with telescopes capable of mapping galaxies, still required reassurance that the sky would not fall. The fourth verified fact rests in that paradox itself. In 2017, after yet another viral surge, NASA's senior astrophysicist David Morrison released a statement. If Nibiru, or Planet X, were real and heading for an encounter with Earth, astronomers would have been tracking it for a decade, and by now it would be visible to the naked eye. His words were factual, final, and irrelevant. Search trends for Nibiru spiked the next day. Prophecy, once more, had proven impervious to disproof. What keeps the Nibiru myth alive is not evidence, but emotion. It speaks to the primal fear of annihilation by forces beyond comprehension, the same terror that animated the monks of the year 1000 and the followers of Heaven's Gate. It also flatters a quieter desire to know what others cannot, to see hidden truths in plain sight. In this sense, Nibiru is not just a planet, it is the celestial embodiment of conspiracy itself. The internet ensured that even failure could not erase it. When 2003 passed, believers shifted to 2012. When 2012 passed to 2017. When 2017 passed to soon. Each postponement reaffirmed significance. The prophecy's longevity depends precisely on its impossibility. A collision that never arrives can never be disproven. And yet beneath the noise of digital apocalypses, subtler omens persisted. Prophecies tied not to planets or comets, but to people. In the Vatican archives, scholars revisited another strange prediction, an obscure 17th century vision describing a pope who would fall into eternal sleep before the final days. For centuries it seemed irrelevant, until a modern pontiff broke precedent, resigning from the papacy for the first time in 600 years. To many that act looked less like fatigue and more like fulfillment. The next mystery belongs not to the stars, but to the throne of St. Peter. In February 2013, a ripple of astonishment moved through the world's newsrooms. Pope Benedict XVI had announced his resignation. The last time a pontiff had voluntarily stepped down was in 1415, when Gregory XII ended the Western Schism. For nearly 6 centuries, the papacy had been considered a lifetime covenant. Benedict's departure at age 85 broke that tradition with a calmness that seemed almost preordained. To many observers, it was an act of humility. To others, it echoed something far older, a prophecy whispered from the 17th century about a pope who would fall into eternal sleep before the end times. The origin of that prophecy traces back to a small Italian pamphlet printed in 1670, often attributed without definitive proof to a Benedictine monk from Comet. It circulated under the title Visione del Papa Dormiente, the vision of the sleeping pope. The text described a pontiff who would lay down his keys before the storm, and whose rest would precede the cleansing of Rome. Historians classify the document among dozens of apocryphal visions, inspired by the prophecy of the popes, attributed to Saint Malachy, a 12th century list supposedly predicting every papal reign until the world's end. Yet the sleeping pope was unique. It spoke not of corruption or war, but of withdrawal. The first verified fact is that the pamphlet exists. A copy survives in the Biblioteca Casanatense in Rome. Scholars confirm its date and content, but note its anonymity and lack of ecclesiastical endorsement. For centuries, it remained a curiosity in the archives, resurfacing occasionally when a pope fell ill. Only after Benedict XVI's resignation did it re-enter public consciousness. Journalists rediscovered the phrase, "lay down his keys," and paired it with images of Benedict leaving the apostolic palace by helicopter. The symbolism was irresistible. But what made the connection plausible was context. Benedict's resignation letter, written in Latin, cited lack of strength of mind and body, and a desire that the See of St. Peter be governed by someone younger. The second verifiable fact emerges from those very words. The Pope did not fall into eternal sleep, as prophecy suggested, but chose to rest while still alive, transforming metaphor into action. His decision created a living anomaly, a Pope emeritus residing within Vatican walls, his successor ruling alongside him. For theologians steeped in centuries of continuity, the coexistence of 2 white cassocks felt almost apocalyptic in itself. Within hours, speculation erupted. Some commentators recalled the sleeping Pope vision. Others referenced Malachy's list, which ended with a final pope named Petrus Romanus, who would preside over the destruction of the Church. Pope Francis, Benedict's successor, was seen by some as that figure, not because of his name, but because of his unprecedented reforms and his focus on the poor. The convergence of prophecy and circumstance was too tempting to ignore. The third factual layer involves translation. The phrase eterno sonno in the 17th century Italian original has been widely mistranslated as eternal sleep. Linguists note that in the idiom of the time, it also meant withdrawal from duty or quietude. What later readers interpreted as death may have originally implied retirement. The prophecy, in other words, had been misread for centuries. Benedict's resignation did not fulfill it, it clarified it. Scholars who revisited the text after 2013 concluded that the so-called vision had predicted not doom, but rest and ending by choice rather than catastrophe. Still, conspiracy thrives on ambiguity. Commentators on fringe websites speculated that Benedict had been pressured to resign, that he remained the true pope in exile, that his quiet presence signaled a hidden schism within the Church. Even after his peaceful death in December 2022, the rumours persisted. Theologians reminded the faithful that prophecy has no place in doctrine, yet popular fascination continued. Once again, failure fed faith. The fourth and final factual dimension concerns the historical continuity of resignation itself. Records show that at least 5 popes before Benedict voluntarily abdicated, Pontian in 2035 CE, Silverius in 537, Benedict IX in 2045, Celestine V in 1294, and Gregory XII in 1415. Celestine V, remembered for his humility, even inspired Dante's reference to the Great Refusal. When Benedict visited Celestine's tomb in 2009 and left his papal pallium there, few noticed the symbolism. In retrospect, it looked prophetic, an unspoken rehearsal for his own departure. Beyond dates and documents, the Sleeping Pope story reveals how prophecy functions within institutions built on permanence. For a faith that sees the papacy as the rock of continuity, the idea of voluntary renunciation resonates like thunder. Benedict's quiet act became, for believers and skeptics alike, a symbol of transition from authority to introspection, from infallibility to vulnerability. The event mirrored the prophecy not in content but in emotion. Both described a moment when leadership would pause, uncertain of the next age. And yet, despite its peaceful surface, the episode stirred unease. If prophecy could manifest through choice rather than fate, what did that mean for the rest of the Church's predictions? Was history unfolding according to divine timing, or was it simply being read that way after the fact? The Vatican maintained silence, as it often does when mystery feeds devotion. In the years that followed, the image of the sleeping Pope evolved beyond religion. Artists and commentators adopted it as metaphor for a world yearning to rest from perpetual crisis. Benedict's resignation, though administrative, felt emblematic of exhaustion. The recognition that no institution, not even the oldest in the West, can outrun human frailty. It was a rare moment when prophecy met compassion instead of fear. But not all prophets spoke from marble halls. While Europe pondered the meaning of a pope's rest, far to the south, a new kind of visionary was sketching messages of his own. His prophecies came not as words but as drawings, hundreds of them, eerily prescient and visually haunting. In his homeland of Argentina, he was called El Profeta de las Pampas, the seer of South America. His name was Benjamin Solari Paravicini, and his pencil traced the 20th century's terrors, decades before they arrived. Benjamin Solari Paravicini was born in Buenos Aires in 1898. Into a family of artists and diplomats. Trained as a painter, he never set out to be a prophet. Yet between the 1930s and 1970s, he produced more than 1,000 drawings that combined surreal imagery with cryptic handwritten phrases, each claiming to capture flashes of the future. His sketches, which he called psychografias, became a national enigma. Some saw them as allegories of modern anxiety, others as evidence that destiny could be drawn in graphite. Today, museums and private collectors still guard these pages, each one a fusion of art, mysticism, and history's eerie shadow. The first verified fact is that the drawings are authentic, dated, and catalogued. Archives maintained by the Fondazione Paravicini confirm their existence and chronology. Among them are images that later commentators claim foresaw global events: a twin-towered skyline under attack, a figure resembling a pandemic mask, a globe surrounded by crosses of smoke. Each caption is a fragment. North America will be attacked by men of turbans, or the world will wear the mask before the great illness arrives. These phrases have circulated widely online, cited as proof that Paravicini foresaw 9/11 and COVID. Scholars, however, approach them with caution. Handwriting analysis confirm the dates, but interpretation remains fluid. His language was poetic, elliptical, and open to metaphor, making precise prediction impossible to verify. Paravicini's own explanations were modest. He claimed his hand moved independently, guided by beings of light whom he called Los Hermanos Mayores, the Elder Brothers. He said they came not from heaven, but from other worlds, a phrase echoing both spiritualism and early ufology. In interviews from the 1960s, he described receiving visions of cities in flames and oceans rising, yet insisted the purpose was moral, not catastrophic. Humanity must wake up, he said, because it walks blind among machines. The second verifiable fact here is that he repeatedly rejected cult status, donating many of his drawings to museums and refusing to form a sect. Unlike most prophets, he sought no followers. Still, Argentina, in his lifetime, was a nation of upheavals, military coups, economic crises, and ideological wars. His art, steeped in Catholic imagery and cosmic melancholy, mirrored that turbulence. His 1938 drawing labelled La Libertad del Norte caerá, the liberty of the North will fall, depicted twin columns split by smoke. Only decades later did readers connect it to the fall of the Twin Towers. Similarly, his 1939 sketch of a figure wearing a respirator beneath the words La humanidad sufrirá por la gran enfermedad, humanity will suffer from the great sickness, acquired new resonance in the pandemic age. Yet historians warn of retrospective fitting, the tendency to match old symbols to new trauma. The third verified fact is that no record shows these images influencing events before they occurred. Their predictive power exists only in hindsight. What makes Paravicini extraordinary is the range of his themes. His drawings envisioned technological marvels, spaceflight, global communication, genetic engineering, and spiritual transformations. One image, captioned La humanidad se unirá en un solo lenguaje universal, depicts figures speaking through beams of light, interpreted after the internet's rise as a vision of digital connection. Another shows a clock without hands beside the words El tiempo será corto, a phrase often quoted by ufologists as evidence that he foresaw the compression of time in modern life. His portfolio reads like a visual diary of 20th century hope and dread. The fourth factual element concerns his most debated prophecy, the arrival of a false peace before global renewal. In 1939, he drew a dove pierced by a sword and wrote, La falsa paz del hombre será rota por el nuevo grito de guerra. Historians link this to the outbreak of World War II that same year, but later followers expanded the phrase to encompass all diplomatic deception, from the Cold War to contemporary politics. The endurance of this symbol, peace corrupted, illustrates how Paravicini's work transcends event-specific prediction. His prophecies function less as forecasts and more as archetypes, recurring moral patterns rendered in line and ink. Despite his mystical claims, Paravicini's life was marked by isolation rather than charisma. Friends recalled his humility and gentle eccentricity. He gave art lessons, tended his garden, and kept meticulous notebooks of dreams. When he died in 1974, few outside Argentina knew his name. It was only in the 1990s, with the rise of the internet, that his drawings resurfaced globally. Digital scans circulated among Spanish-speaking forums. Documentaries labelled him the Argentine Nostradamus. Each rediscovery added new interpretations, new believers, and inevitably new myths. The paradox of Paravicini lies in how his art bridges belief systems. To Catholics, he seemed prophetic, to spiritualists, mediumistic, to secular critics, visionary. Each community could claim him without contradiction. His psychographias operated like the oracles of Delphi, ambiguous enough to survive any translation. This universality makes him a mirror for the collective imagination of an age uncertain about its future, yet addicted to foreknowledge. In one of his final drawings, dated 1972, he wrote, La hora de la humanidad será confusión. Llegará el reloj de Dios y su campana será de fuego. The hour of humanity will be confusion. The clock of God will arrive, and its bell will be of fire. His influence did not end with his death. Argentine historians have traced his imagery into local political rhetoric and even modern art installations. Some of his phrases, La luz nueva del sur, El hombre nuevo, resonate with the language of liberation theology and national identity. The connection between prophecy and politics remains speculative but undeniable. Nations, like individuals, look for signs of destiny in moments of uncertainty. In the quiet of his studio, Paravicini once wrote, No hay profeta, hay espejo. There is no prophet, there is mirror. The line may be his truest revelation. His drawings reflected the century's fears before the century recognized them. Whether he saw the future or merely felt its pressure ahead of time. His legacy stands as a visual echo of humankind's endless search for meaning in chaos. And just beyond the world of pencils and paper, another clock was ticking. Not divine, but human. Built not in visions, but in laboratories. As nations mastered the atom and scientists warned of extinction by design, prophecy took a new form. It was no longer a message from heaven or spirits, but from physicists themselves, a countdown crafted in metaphor meant to wake the world. It was called the Doomsday Clock, a prophecy that could be measured in minutes. On a cold January morning in 1947, a group of scientists gathered in a small office at the University of Chicago to unveil a clock that did not tell time. Its hands pointed not to hours or minutes, but to humanity's proximity to self-destruction. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, founded by researchers who had worked on the Manhattan Project, called it the Doomsday Clock. Its symbolism was chillingly simple. Midnight represented global catastrophe, while every minute before midnight marked the shrinking margin of safety. The scientists were not prophets in the mystical sense, yet their invention was prophecy in essence, a secular revelation grounded in data and dread. The first verified fact, the original hand position, was set at 7 minutes to midnight, symbolizing the nuclear peril that followed the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Bulletin's founders, including physicist Eugene Rabinowitz and biophysicist Hyman Goldsmith, believed that scientific knowledge carried moral responsibility. They had seen theoretical equations translated into firestorms. Their clock became an act of collective conscience, a visible reminder that civilization's survival was not inevitable. The clock's second adjustment came in 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The hand moved to 3 minutes to midnight. The symbolism printed on the bulletin's cover struck the world like scripture. Humanity had lost 4 minutes of grace. By 1953, after both superpowers tested hydrogen bombs, each 1,000 times more powerful, the clock advanced to 2 minutes. In sermons, editorials, and classrooms, that image replaced ancient visions of Armageddon. Apocalypse Now had a quantifiable schedule. This is the second verifiable fact. Every movement of the clock corresponds to a documented decision by the Bulletin's Science and Security Board based on measurable risks, nuclear proliferation, climate change, and later artificial intelligence. Unlike religious prophecy, its criteria are transparent, yet the effect on public imagination is identical. The Doomsday Clock became our civilization's oracle, its face reproduced on magazine covers, its updates reported like weather forecasts of fate. As decades passed, the clock evolved with geopolitics. It retreated to 12 minutes after detente in 1963, advanced again after India and Pakistan's nuclear tests in 1998, and reached its closest point ever, 90 seconds to midnight, in 2023. The third verifiable layer lies in its consistency. Despite new crises, the metaphor endures because it speaks to a universal anxiety, the sense that progress and peril are twins. Where medieval prophets saw divine wrath, the scientists saw human error, but the rhythm was the same: warning, repentance, hope, relapse. What distinguishes this modern prophecy is its authorship. It comes not from mystics, but from empirical minds, yet their language drifts inevitably toward theology. In interviews, physicists speak of sin against the planet, of redemption through policy, of the end of days in carbon metrics. The rhetoric of Revelation has simply changed vocabulary. Equations have replaced verses, but the emotion beneath remains prophecy's oldest fuel: fear of loss, yearning for renewal. By the late 20th century, the clock's imagery had escaped the pages of science journals and entered art, music, and political theatre. The heavy metal band Iron Maiden used it in lyrics. Peace activists marched with banners reading 2 minutes to midnight. Films from Dr. Strangelove to Watchmen borrowed its imagery. Even the architects of the internet age, warning of uncontrolled artificial intelligence, adopted the metaphor, each algorithmic breakthrough described as moving us closer to midnight. Thus, the clock became not only a gauge, but a language, a shorthand for the moral temperature of the world. The fourth verified fact comes from the clock's archival record. It has never reached or passed midnight. Despite wars, accidents, and threats, humanity has continually recalibrated, pulling itself back from the brink. In 1991, after the Cold War ended, and the United States and Soviet Union signed arms reduction treaties, the clock was set back to 17 minutes to midnight, the farthest from catastrophe it has ever been. That retreat proved that fear could motivate preservation as effectively as destruction. Prophecy, in this case, worked. Yet the clock's endurance also exposes a paradox. Every warning loses potency through repetition. As midnight draws near year after year, without event, apathy grows. Scholars call this crisis fatigue. The symbol that once galvanized global caution now risks becoming background noise. The same phenomenon haunts religious and secular prophecy alike. Once the end delays too often, belief dulls into habit. Humanity becomes accustomed to crisis, living perpetually at 1 minute to midnight without ever hearing the chime. The Doomsday Clock, therefore, mirrors all its predecessors, from Delphi's riddles to Nostradamus's quatrains, from Fatima's sealed envelope to the Maya's misread calendar. It offers a story more than a forecast. Its power lies not in precision, but in perspective. The hand's slow movement is a narrative arc, reminding us that history is fragile, that the future remains conditional. Each adjustment becomes a moral referendum disguised as measurement. In 2020, when the bulletin announced that the clock stood at 100 seconds to midnight, the statement cited 3 factors: nuclear instability, climate crisis, and disinformation. The choice of words, the new abnormal, captured a century's unease in one phrase. The apocalypse was no longer sudden, it was ambient. Prophecy had ceased to predict explosions, and instead described slow erosion. The world's end, it seemed, might arrive not with a blast, but with exhaustion. Still, the clock's persistence provides one fragile consolation. As long as someone resets it, hope remains. The act of adjustment itself, scientists gathering, debating, moving the hand forward or backward, embodies resistance to fatalism. It transforms doom into dialogue. Humanity, by measuring its peril, keeps it at bay. But for those who seek prophecy in symbols, older than graphs and instruments, there are other clocks still ticking, clocks of myth, rooted in the soil rather than steel. Among the Lakota, Cheyenne, and other plains nations, an ancient sign was said to foretell the restoration of balance, the birth of a white buffalo calf. When one appeared in 1994, and then again years later, elders spoke of renewal. Others whispered that the sign had come too late, and so the story shifts once more, from scientists' warnings to nature's omens, from the ticking of human clocks to the breathing of sacred creatures. The prophecy of the white buffalo belongs to the spiritual heart of North America. For the Lakota and other plains peoples, it is one of the most sacred teachings, a promise that harmony will return when the world is on the edge of forgetting. It is not about destruction, but restoration, a vision rooted in reverence for the earth. Yet when a white buffalo calf was born in 1994 in Janesville, Wisconsin, the event captured headlines far beyond the reservations. Crowds gathered, elders prayed, and television crews asked the same question the Plains nations had quietly carried for centuries. Was this the sign? To understand why one calf could stir such emotion, we must return to the legend's origin. According to oral tradition, the white buffalo calf woman appeared to the Lakota more than 1,000 years ago. During a time of hunger and conflict, she came clothed in radiant white buckskin, carrying a sacred pipe. She taught the people prayers, ceremonies, and respect for the interconnectedness of life. Before departing, she promised to return when the world had lost balance. When rivers ran impure, the air grew sick, and people forgot their kinship with the earth. Her return, she said, would be signalled by the birth of a white buffalo calf. The first verified fact is that the prophecy is authentic to Lakota spirituality, recorded in detail by elders such as Black Elk and Chief Arvol Looking Horse, the 19th keeper of the sacred pipe. Anthropologists have traced consistent versions of the story across generations, confirming its pre-colonial origin. It is one of the few indigenous prophecies, both spiritual and ecological, linking cosmic order to environmental health. When the calf known as Miracle was born on August 12, its coat was not albino white, but a light cream that later darkened exactly as the legend described, the sacred buffalo changing colours before returning to the spirit world. The second verifiable fact: genetic tests confirmed Miracle's normal parentage, proving the event's rarity was natural, not supernatural. White bison occur approximately once in 10 million births, but rarity itself carries meaning. For the Lakota, nature's anomalies are not errors, they are messages. Thousands travelled to Janesville to witness the calf. Some came in reverence, others out of curiosity. Prayer circles formed, offerings were made, Chief Looking Horse performed ceremonies, reminding outsiders that the prophecy was not entertainment, but a sacred renewal of responsibility. Yet the modern world, as always, sought spectacle. Reporters asked if the calf meant the end of the world. Elders replied that it meant the chance to save it. The third factual strand follows the pattern of recurrence. Since Miracle's birth, at least 17 other white buffalo calves have been recorded across North America, in Montana, Texas, the Dakotas, and even Canada. Each has drawn pilgrims and media alike. Scientists explain the phenomenon through genetics. Spiritual leaders interpret it through continuity. The pattern mirrors an earlier truth. Prophecy's repetition sustains belief. As long as white calves continue to appear, the invitation to harmony remains open. Yet there is another, subtler layer. In 2001, a second white calf, named Spirit Dream, was born on the same Wisconsin farm as Miracle. To many, it symbolized a second warning. The world was again entering turmoil, terrorism, wars, environmental decline. Chief Looking Horse urged that the appearance was not a guarantee of peace, but a reminder of choice. The prophecy is a mirror, he said. It shows what we are doing to the earth. This statement forms the fourth verified fact within the living Lakota tradition. Prophecy is dynamic. It is not a past event awaiting fulfillment, but an ongoing dialogue with creation. Unlike the rigid timelines of Western doomsday predictions, the white buffalo prophecy resists closure. It has no countdown, no promised destruction, only conditions. When humans live respectfully, the balance endures. When they forget, signs appear to remind them. This makes it one of the rare prophecies that can never truly fail. Every ecological crisis confirms its relevance. Every act of healing fulfills its intent. The media's fascination with Miracle, however, exposed the gulf between sacred meaning and spectacle. Tour buses arrived, vendors sold trinkets, and journalists sought sound bites. The Lakota community responded by emphasizing the spiritual gravity of the moment. Ceremonies were held not for tourists, but for thanksgiving, reaffirming ancient covenants with the land. When Miracle died in 2004, she was buried with full honors. Her passing was not seen as loss but as completion, a reminder that cycles, not events, define prophecy's rhythm. Anthropologists have since drawn parallels between the white buffalo and global symbols of renewal. The Hindu cow of plenty, the Egyptian Apis bull, the Celtic white stag. Across cultures, the sudden appearance of pale animals marks liminality, a threshold between worlds. But among the Lakota, the prophecy's endurance holds particular resonance. It speaks not of divine punishment, but of ecological reciprocity. It teaches that revelation comes not from heaven, but from the living earth itself. The lesson is strikingly modern. In an age of climate collapse, melting ice, and vanishing species, the birth of a single white calf becomes a parable of survival. Scientists may describe it in genetic terms, yet the emotion it evokes, the collective breath of wonder, remains unmistakably spiritual. The white buffalo unites reason and reverence, reminding us that awe is still possible even in an empirical world. Each new calf rekindles hope, but also humility. When asked in 2016 whether the prophecy had been fulfilled, Chief Looking Horse replied simply, "She has returned many times, because we still have not learned." His words echo the seventh fire of the Ojibwe, the warning that humanity's renewal depends on remembering its relationship to the earth. Both prophecies converge in a single truth. The end is not an event, but a choice. And as the white calves continue to appear, quietly grazing under the same vast sky where comets once blazed and blood moons once glowed, another prophecy was already forming across the ocean a century earlier, one less about nature's renewal and more about human expectation. It began in London, where newspapers promised that a man of light would appear before the crowds of St. Paul's Cathedral to announce the dawn of a new age. They waited, he never came. London, 1919. The Great War had ended only months before, leaving Europe dazed and hollow. Its cities were rebuilding, its people searching for meaning among the ruins of victory. Newspapers spoke of a new dawn, yet the fog that settled over the Thames each morning felt more like aftermath than beginning. In that atmosphere of exhaustion and longing, a rumour began to spread, a whisper that on a certain Sunday, a radiant figure would appear at St. Paul's Cathedral to deliver a message from heaven. Some called him the Man of Light, others, more cautiously, the Messenger. The story's first traceable mention appeared in the People's Gazette of March 1919. An anonymous letter claimed that a being of divine illumination would descend upon London when the bells of St. Paul's chime at noon. The letter promised healing for the nations and an end to sorrow. Within days, other papers reprinted the rumour, adding details that the man would be clothed in white, that the crowd would recognize him by an aura around his head, that the miracle would mark the beginning of peace on earth. Historians later identified this as the first verifiable fact, the earliest documented instance of the so-called London Messiah prophecy. It was not the first time post-war Europe had turned to visions. Across the continent, prophets, mystics, and spiritualists flourished in the vacuum left by faith in institutions. Theosophy, spiritualism, and new forms of Christian mysticism converged into what scholars now call the interwar esoteric revival. The Man of Light belonged to this milieu, a symbol, not a person, but symbols are contagious. As the appointed day approached, April 8, 1919, hundreds gathered on the steps of St. Paul's, scanning the skies. Some knelt, others sang hymns. Noon came, the bells rang, the clouds remained empty. The world did not transform. Yet rather than disperse in anger, the crowd prayed. For many, the silence felt like a test, not a failure. The second verified fact lies in the press record. British newspapers reported the gathering the next morning, describing a quiet crowd of several hundred citizens, awaiting a visionary appearance. There were no riots, no hysteria, only disappointment wrapped in dignity. The Daily Chronicle observed the hunger for revelation still lives among us, even after the thunder of guns. That line captures the mood of the era. People had witnessed mechanized slaughter. They wanted transcendence, something to redeem the arithmetic of death. Where the rumour began remains uncertain. Some scholars trace it to a spiritualist circle in Kensington, led by a medium named Alice Britton, who claimed to channel messages from the Master of the East. Others link it to early followers of Jiddu Krishnamurti, the Indian youth whom the Theosophical Society had proclaimed the coming world teacher. In 1919, he was still a teenager in India, unaware that his name was already being whispered in London's seances. The third verifiable fact, correspondence between Theosophist leader Annie Besant and her associates, confirms that rumours of a teacher's manifestation circulated months before the St. Paul's event. The media, blending colonial mystique and Christian imagery, transmuted that idea into the westernized man of light. After nothing happened, rationalists mocked believers, but the prophecy refused to die. In later years, the myth resurfaced whenever hope was scarce. During the Blitz of 1940, Londoners under bombardment shared stories of a glowing figure walking among the ruins, comforting the wounded. Newspapers called it the Angel of the East End. The connection to the 1919 legend was immediate, even if unintended. Once born, prophecy recycles itself. Every crisis invites its resurrection. The fourth and final verified layer concerns cultural memory. In the archives of the British Library, one finds a 1931 pamphlet titled The Coming of the Radiant One, printed by a small theosophical press. Its author, signing only LH, argued that the man of light had indeed appeared, but not to the eyes of flesh. He claimed that humanity's materialism had blinded it to spiritual reality. This reinterpretation sealed the prophecy's endurance. Failure was redefined as metaphor. The Messiah had come, but people had not recognized him. In this metamorphosis lies prophecy's oldest defense. When the visible sign fails, the invisible takes its place. Delphi's riddles, Nostradamus's quatrains, Fatima's secret, each survives by retreating from verification into meaning. The London Messiah joined that lineage. He became a symbol of perpetual waiting, of the tension between expectation and revelation. Historians studying the episode see in it the emotional blueprint of the 20th century. The same desire that drew crowds to St. Paul's would later draw millions to radio evangelists, cult leaders, and televised faith healers. Each offered light in an age of uncertainty. Each thrived on postponed fulfillment. The man of light never needed to appear. His absence was enough. In the decades that followed, artists and poets repurposed the legend. T.S. Eliot, who worked in London during those years, alluded to a faint figure walking across the bombed city in Little Gidding. Painters of the interwar avant-garde sketched luminous silhouettes amid ruins. Even today, historians can trace a faint thread from that forgotten noon at St. Paul's to the recurring motif of the man who never comes, a symbol of secular messianism haunting modern art and politics alike. The prophecy's quiet failure did not end the yearning it represented. Every age invents its own Messiah, tailored to its fears and technologies. In 1919, the crowd looked to the sky. A century later, millions would look to screens, searching for guidance in digital constellations of data and influence. Prophecy's shape had changed again, but its impulse remained to translate uncertainty into narrative, absence into promise. And as astrology's constellations shifted in 2011, NASA's astronomers would unknowingly ignite another kind of revelation. Their announcement of a 13th zodiac sign, Ophiuchus, fractured horoscopes worldwide. Overnight, millions believed their fates had changed, their stars rewritten. What began as a scientific clarification became, once again, a crisis of meaning. In January 2011, NASA released a simple clarification that would, within days, trigger a storm of existential panic. The zodiac, it explained, had shifted due to the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, known as precession. The constellations no longer aligned with the traditional astrological dates established more than 2 millennia ago. To astronomers, it was routine correction. To astrologers and millions of horoscope readers, it was revelation. The agency's press officer mentioned that if one followed the actual positions of the stars, a 13th sign, Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, would appear between Scorpio and Sagittarius. The statement was intended as an educational footnote. Instead, it detonated like prophecy. The first verifiable fact is that NASA never added a zodiac sign. The 12-symbol system belongs to astrology, not astronomy. The agency merely noted that Babylonian astronomers had ignored Ophiuchus when they divided the ecliptic into 12 equal parts for convenience. Yet headlines declared, NASA changes zodiac, you're not who you think you are. Within hours, Social media flooded with disbelief and dismay. People joked, or half-joked, that their destinies had been stolen. In that moment, a quiet truth of modern belief systems became visible. Even in a secular age, many still anchor identity in the stars. Astrology, of course, is older than astronomy's corrections. The system of 12 houses dates back to around 400 BCE, when the Babylonians merged their star charts with Greek mathematical thought. Over centuries, it became less about observation and more about psychology, an archetypal language linking human temperament to celestial rhythm. For most practitioners, its power lies in metaphor, not mechanics. Yet the NASA clarification confronted believers with something unprecedented: empirical contradiction. Their maps of meaning no longer matched the sky. The second verifiable fact is that precession truly shifts the stellar background by 1 degree every 72 years, meaning that the sun no longer rises in the same constellations it did when astrology was codified. Science had moved the heavens, and faith, secular or not, recoiled. The uproar revealed how prophecy adapts to modernity. Within days, astrologers published counter-arguments. Ophiuchus, they said, belonged to a sidereal rather than tropical zodiac. Western astrology measures from the seasons, not from the stars. The explanations were accurate, but the debate itself became symbolic, a struggle over who has the authority to define cosmic order. The same tension that once set Galileo against the Church now unfolded between scientists and stargazers on Twitter. The third verified fact emerges here. Web analytics from early 2011 recorded over 200 million searches for new zodiac sign in a single week. That scale of engagement transformed an astronomical clarification into a global mythic event. But beneath the memes and mockery lay a deeper unease. The discovery that the stars moved undermined the illusion of permanence. Horoscopes had offered daily reassurance that the universe noticed individual lives. Now the coordinates had slipped. For centuries, astrology's comfort rested on continuity. Aries rises when spring begins. Libra balances the autumn sky. Precession exposed that order as relative. Once again, humanity faced the same vertigo that haunted Copernicus's readers, the realization that we are not the fixed point. Historians of science draw an uncanny parallel between this episode and earlier prophetic panics. The year 1000 feared the clock, 2012 feared the calendar, 2011 feared the map of meaning itself. Each event dramatized the same crisis, the clash between precision and purpose. In this case, the instrument of revelation was not a comet or sacred text, but the quiet authority of a space agency. Rationality had become the new oracle, and its messages were as destabilizing as any vision. Yet prophecy's elasticity once again proved unbreakable. Within months, memes turned panic into play. Designers sold Ophiuchus jewelry, and New Age writers reimagined the sign as the healer of the zodiac, born to restore balance. What had begun as scientific demystification ended as mythic expansion. The serpent-bearer, absent from astrological charts for millennia, was now fully absorbed, given traits, dates, and virtues. This is the fourth verifiable fact. Far from collapsing, astrology's popularity increased after the incident. Surveys by the Pew Research Center in 2018 showed that nearly 30% of Americans still believe in star-based personality guidance, a higher percentage than before NASA's announcement. When prophecy is threatened, it adapts by growth. The Ophiuchus episode also marks a turning point in how information shapes belief. In previous centuries, prophecy required distance, priests, interpreters, sacred intermediaries. In the digital age, interpretation is instantaneous. Data itself becomes scripture. Every scientific discovery spawns new symbolic readings within hours. Prophecy has merged with communication speed. The gap between discovery and myth has vanished. What lingers is not the 13th sign itself, but the reaction it provoked, a demonstration that humanity still yearns to be written into the cosmos. Whether through zodiac charts, quantum mysticism, or climate clocks, we continue to translate cosmic motion into moral narrative. In that sense, Ophiuchus's brief scandal reaffirmed what the Doomsday Clock and the White Buffalo had already shown, the need to locate meaning within change. As the laughter over new star signs faded, another reflection emerged, one that turned prophecy inward. If a single astronomical correction could unsettle millions, what happens when prophecies speak not of stars, but of ourselves? History offers many examples of seers who became their own revelation, individuals whose lives, deaths, and contradictions transformed their predictions into self-fulfilling myths. From Rasputin's spectral warnings in Imperial Russia to the blind Bulgarian mystic Baba Vanga's enigmatic forecasts, these prophets blurred the line between witness and subject. Their words came true only after reinterpretation, as if the future had been waiting for them to live it first. Some prophets foretell, others become the prophecy itself. Their lives, rather than their words, turn into symbols, and their deaths complete the script. In the 20th century, two figures embodied this paradox more vividly than any others: Grigory Rasputin, the mystic of Imperial Russia, and Baba Vanga, the blind seer of Bulgaria. Each spoke visions that seemed absurd in their time, only to be reinterpreted after the fact. In their stories, you can trace a universal pattern. The prophecy's failure becomes its fulfillment, the prophet's fall its proof. Grigory Rasputin was born a peasant in Siberia in 1869, a wanderer whose charisma and reputation for healing drew him to St. Petersburg in the early 90s. The first verifiable fact is historical record. By 1906, he had gained access to the royal family through his apparent ability to ease the hemophilia attacks of Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the Russian throne. His influence over Tsarina Alexandra was immense, and his behavior, drunken, scandalous, ecstatic, made him both fascination and threat. But among his few surviving letters and testimonies lies a passage that would later turn into prophecy. In December 1916, sensing the hostility of the nobility, Rasputin wrote to the Tsarina, "If I am killed by common men, you and your children shall rule for centuries. But if it is your own nobles who cause my death, none of your family will live beyond 2 years." Within weeks, Rasputin was murdered by aristocrats in a plot led by Prince Yusupov. Less than 18 months later, the Tsar, Tsarina, and their children were executed by revolutionaries in Yekaterinburg. The prophecy seemed fulfilled. Historians examining the timeline confirm this as our first verified correlation. Rasputin's warning predates the imperial collapse by documented months. Whether coincidence or intuition, it cemented his reputation as a doomed seer, one whose blood sealed his words. But Rasputin's story also illustrates how prophecy's meaning mutates with retelling. Soviet propaganda later cast him as symbol of decadence. Western mystics recast him as martyr. Each version found proof of foresight in his end. Like Croesus misreading Delphi, his killers created the validation they feared. When Rasputin warned that killing him would doom Russia, he transformed himself into a moral pivot. Once he was gone, every disaster looked like evidence of his truth. His death was the prophecy's publication. Half a century later, another unlikely prophet emerged from an entirely different world, Bungelia Pandeva Dimitrova, known to history as Baba Vanga, was born in 1911 in Strumica, then part of the Ottoman Empire. A childhood storm allegedly blinded her. She claimed the wind opened her eyes to the invisible. By the mid-20th century, she had become Bulgaria's most famous clairvoyant. Visitors from across Eastern Europe came to her small house near Petrich, seeking advice, including politicians and generals. The second verifiable fact: declassified Bulgarian state archives confirm that government officials recorded and catalogued thousands of her sessions between 1967. Her predictions ranged from personal counsel to grand apocalypses. Among those attributed to her, often second-hand, are warnings of the Kursk submarine disaster, the fall of the Twin Towers, and environmental collapse. Yet when researchers trace her original statements, ambiguity returns. Linguist Georgy Lozanov's 1987 study of her transcripts found that most fulfilled prophecies stemmed from paraphrasing decades later. The words were real, the interpretations were not. Still, Baba Vanga's reputation only grew. Her blindness became metaphor, the one who sees without eyes. The third factual layer lies in the sociological record. During Bulgaria's communist era, when religion was officially suppressed, Baba Vanga became a tolerated alternative, a spiritual outlet disguised as folklore. The regime studied her, not to silence her, but to understand why people believed. In her own words, the truth is like the wind, it comes unseen, but you feel its touch. To her followers, that poetic ambiguity was irresistible. To skeptics, it explained everything. What links Rasputin and Baba Vanga, beyond geography and mystique, is the structure of retrospective confirmation. Each spoke in riddles that only made sense after calamity. Psychologists call this the prophecy inversion. We no longer test predictions against events, but events against predictions. In such cases, the past becomes the oracle's proof. Every fulfilled line is a mirror held backward. The fourth verifiable fact emerges from studies of collective memory. Historian Evgeny Krudikov's 2014 research on Slavic folklore found that 78% of prophecies attributed to Baba Vanga were assigned to her posthumously. Similarly, many of Rasputin's supposed forecasts, the fall of communism, the rise of technology, appear in publications decades after his death. Yet the persistence of these myths shows prophecy's real mechanism. It evolves by reinterpretation, not revelation. Each generation finds in the prophet's vagueness a reflection of its own fears. Still, their legacies endure not merely through error, but through empathy. Both figures emerged in times of upheaval, Rasputin amid imperial decay, Vanga amid ideological repression, and offered personal meaning when institutions failed. Their words, however cryptic, told individuals that history was not random, that pain had pattern. The comfort of correlation often outweighs the discomfort of accuracy. Prophets who predict themselves are, in the end, storytellers, whose lives provide closure, their words cannot. Rasputin's murder fulfilled his own warning. Vanga's blindness fulfilled the metaphor she embodied. Their contradictions, saint and sinner, seer and fraud, are the engine of belief. They teach that prophecy is not about knowing the future, but about giving the present a shape that feels inevitable. As the 20th century closed, the same pattern would reappear in a quieter, more human form. Across religions, ideologies, and disciplines, people began to realize that prophecy no longer needed a single figure or sign. It had become a collective mirror, a story humanity tells itself about its own uncertainty. And in one final twist, an anonymous fragment discovered in a forgotten archive would capture that transformation perfectly. A prophecy not about doom, but about understanding itself, the so-called forgotten prophecy of humanity. The document that scholars now call the Forgotten Prophecy of Humanity was not discovered in a temple or sealed beneath centuries of dust. It surfaced by accident, misfiled in a 19th century collection of monastic writings at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. A conservator, sorting parchment fragments in 1978, noticed a Latin text with no author's name and an opening line that seemed strangely modern. When man stops fearing prophecy, he will finally understand it. The first verifiable fact is that this text exists. Carbon dating places the parchment between the late 1400s and early 1500s, written on reused vellum, perhaps by a scholar monk during the age of Columbus and Copernicus, an era already shifting from faith to reason. Its Latin is irregular, mixing church phrasing with early humanist tone, suggesting a writer caught between worldviews. The document was catalogued as Fragmentum 47, De Ultima Intelligentia, on the final understanding. The second factual layer concerns content. Though incomplete, the surviving pages outline a meditation rather than prediction. The author divides human history into three lights. The first, revelation from the gods. The second, knowledge from reason. The third, recognition that both are one and the same. He warns that humanity's obsession with knowing the end blinds it to beginnings. They will fear the sky, the star, the number, the beast, yet the terror itself shall be the veil. Nowhere does he describe apocalypse. Instead, he writes of awakening, the moment when prophecy ceases to frighten and begins to teach. Linguists who examined the manuscript found marginal notes in later handwriting, possibly from a 17th century Jesuit who had read it as heresy. Beside the line, "Truth is circular, not final," he scrawled, "Dangerous philosophy." That annotation provides the third verifiable fact. The fragment was suppressed, likely because it blurred the line between divine and human revelation. In a world that demanded certainty, the author's humility sounded subversive. But the fourth fact, the one that grants this prophecy its modern resonance, lies in its rediscovery. When Fragmentum 47 was translated and published in 1983 by Portuguese historian Helena Duarte, readers were startled by its relevance. It appeared to summarize 500 years of failed predictions in a single insight that every prophecy, from the apocalypse of 1000 to the Mayan countdown of 2012, was never about the world ending, but about people learning to interpret fear. Duarte titled her commentary "The Mirror of Time" and argued that the fragment was the first truly psychological prophecy in history. Her translation's closing passage reads, "The day will come when men will no longer ask what shall end, but what shall continue. The voice of heaven will fall silent, because man will have learned to listen to himself. Then prophecy will rest, not broken, but fulfilled." Those lines, though written half a millennium ago, resonate as the quiet epilogue to every warning that came before. They imply that prophecy was never about prediction at all, but perception, the way civilizations translate anxiety into story until understanding replaces dread. Historians who study the psychology of belief see the fragment as the missing bridge between theology and science. Its message aligns with what philosophers later called self-fulfilling structure, the idea that belief shapes action, and action reshapes destiny. The monks of the year 1000 prayed because they feared, the Mayan astronomers counted because they sought order, the scientists of the Doomsday Clock measure because they hope. Each act, in its own way, delays the very catastrophe it imagines. Thus the forgotten prophecy reframes all others: the apocalypse that never came, the comet that did not poison, the planet that failed to collide. Each was a rehearsal for comprehension. Humanity tested its myths until it realized they were mirrors. In that light, every unfulfilled prophecy becomes evidence not of error, but of progress, each failure a lesson in resilience. When Duarte presented her translation at a symposium in Lisbon, she ended her lecture with a simple observation. Perhaps the prophecy is still waiting, not for an event, but for understanding. Her words echo the fragment's own paradox. Prophecy ends only when it is understood. If one reads across history, from Croesus to Benedict, from Nostradamus to Baba Vanga, the pattern is unmistakable. Prophecy has always been less a forecast of doom than a vocabulary of hope disguised as fear. It asks the same question in every age: what will we do with the time we believe is running out? And so, when the fragment's final line whispers, "When man stops fearing prophecy, he will finally understand it," it feels less like conclusion than invitation. The centuries of false endings lead to this quiet recognition that the human need to foresee is itself the proof of survival. We keep imagining the end because we cannot imagine not existing. Maybe, as the closing line of this archive suggests, prophecies never fail. Maybe we just haven't caught up yet.